My name is Amber Reyes, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2023 when I, along with my closest friends, decided to leave the familiarity of Des Moines behind in search of something extraordinary. We craved adventure, a break from our daily routines, and the thrill of confronting legends head-on. None of us imagined that our RV road trip to the remote woodlands near Deora, Iowa, would transform into a harrowing fight for our lives against an ancient, supernatural terror. I'd always been the de facto leader of our small group, a blend of determination and resourcefulness that had steered us through past escapades. My companions were equally unique. Lucas Burke, the pragmatic skeptic whose logic often clashed with the inexplicable. Mia Thompson, whose sensitive and intuitive nature made her an uncanny early warning system for danger. And Jason Carter, the irreverent joker whose humor masked deep-seated fears. Together, we set off with our rickety RV, a vehicle that, even at the start, creaked with every mile and bore the marks of many previous adventures. The journey began with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Our RV's aging generator sputtered to life after a few attempts, and the malfunctioning GPS had us relying on outdated maps and whispered directions from locals along the highways. We were making good time despite these setbacks, laughing off the minor inconveniences as mere quirks of old machinery. Yet, as the sun dipped low over the Iowa plains, the horizon darkened not only in light but in promise of something much more sinister. We arrived at a clearing just outside a dense stand of pines bordering the Deora woodlands. The area had a notorious reputation among locals, rumors of a curse, a witch's legacy merged with indigenous lore that eerily echoed the Wendigo myth. The rumors had been dismissed by most, but in our hearts they stirred a blend of excitement and unease. I parked the RV near a copse of trees and we began setting up our temporary camp, our laughter mingling with the gentle rustle of autumn leaves. That first night, while we sat around a small portable fire trying to stave off the chill, Lucas joked about the old wives' tales of witch curses and hungry spirits. Mia, her eyes far away as if she were listening to voices only she could hear, whispered that the night felt too heavy, too expectant. Jason cracked another joke, but his smile was fleeting. As I stared into the dancing flames, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows around us seemed to flicker unnaturally, as if alive and impatient. It wasn't long before the eerie signs began to manifest. Around midnight, as a cool wind picked up, I was roused by an unsettling sound. A series of distant, disembodied giggles that echoed like children's laughter across the silent pines. I stepped outside, and the temperature had dropped drastically. The fire's warmth seemed futile against the creeping cold. I could see my breath, and in that moment, the woods looked both inviting and ominous. The next morning, while scouting the area near the RV, we discovered strange symbols carved into the bark of several trees. The carvings were an unsettling fusion of Native American motifs and what looked like archaic runes, hinting at an ancient ritual or curse. Jason, ever the adventurer, picked up a fragment of a broken wooden talisman lying nearby. I took it as a bad omen, a silent warning that our intrusion into these woods might awaken something best left undisturbed. A few days into our trip, as we navigated winding backroads with our unreliable RV, the tension among us began to rise. Lucas's persistent insistence on rational explanations clashed with Mia's increasingly vivid premonitions. "I saw something in the woods last night, Amber," Mia confided in a trembling whisper. "It wasn't just a trick of the light. It felt like someone, or something, was watching us." Lucas scoffed at her words, attributing them to an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies. Yet even he couldn't dismiss the unease that gnawed at him every time the generator failed or the RV's engine coughed out a sputter of discontent. That night, after a long day of navigating treacherous backroads and deciphering outdated maps, the true horror made itself known. We had stopped to camp near an old, overgrown trail when the RV's side was suddenly and violently struck by an unseen force. I remember the sickening crunch of metal and the terrified shouts that followed. Rushing outside, I found that something had slammed into our vehicle, leaving deep gashes along its side. The temperature plummeted further, and the oppressive darkness of the forest seemed to press in on all sides. We retreated into the RV, hearts pounding, when the laughter of children returned, this time louder, closer, and laced with a mournful quality. Lucas tried to calm us with reason, but his voice wavered. Jason's usual quips were replaced by a stark silence, and even Mia seemed paralyzed with dread. As I sat there, trying to steady my racing heart, I could almost feel a presence outside, a malevolent force lurking just beyond the thin barrier of our fragile shelter. In the morning's weak light, Jason discovered an old, weathered journal half buried in the brush near an abandoned cabin we passed. The journal's pages were brittle with age, the handwriting spidery and desperate. It spoke of a hunger in the woods, of a curse born from a witch's dark ritual intertwined with the ancient traditions of the indigenous people of the region, a curse that called forth a hybrid entity. It described a creature that could manifest as a ghostly apparition on one moment and take on a hulking, animalistic form reminiscent of the Wendigo the next. The entries warned of its predatory nature and its relentless pursuit of those who dared disturb its resting ground. As I read the journal aloud to the group, a heavy silence fell over us. Lucas, though still clinging to his skepticism, could not ignore the mounting evidence of something truly malevolent at work. "We need to find that cabin," I insisted, the journal clutched in my trembling hand. "It might hold the key to breaking this curse." Mia nodded silently, her eyes haunted by visions only she could see, while Jason, his voice low and uncharacteristically somber, agreed. Our decision was made. We would follow the clues and confront this ancient evil head-on. The journey to the decrepit cabin was fraught with peril. Our RV, already battered by nature's whims, seemed to falter with every passing mile. The malfunctioning generator and erratic GPS forced us to rely on intuition and the old-fashioned charm of hand-drawn maps. Tensions reached a breaking point as Lucas's logic clashed with the urgency of Mia's premonitions and the raw emotional desperation that was creeping into each of our souls. Every unexpected breakdown, every eerie whisper in the wind, served to heighten the sense of impending doom. One fateful night, as we finally reached the outskirts of the area described in the journal, the supernatural presence revealed itself in full measure. We set up camp near the cabin, its dilapidated structure looming in the distance like a specter from a bygone era. As darkness swallowed the land, the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold, and the forest seemed to come alive with sinister energy. I was on guard when I noticed a movement, a flicker of shadow near the tree line that did not belong. The figure was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. For a moment I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something inside me compelled me to stand my ground. It was then that we realized the entity was not content with merely haunting our camp. It was hunting us. In the ensuing chaos, as we scrambled to secure the RV and gather our meager supplies, the creature attacked with a fury that defied description. Its form shifted in the flickering light, sometimes a spectral silhouette of a woman in tattered robes, other times a monstrous, almost bestial creature with elongated limbs and a ravenous hunger. Lucas, ever the voice of reason, tried to fend it off with a heavy branch, but his efforts were futile against a force born of ancient malice. In the struggle, I watched in horror as Lucas was dragged away into the shadows, his cries echoing in the cold night air before they were abruptly silenced. The loss of Lucas shattered our fragile unity. Grief and guilt mingled with terror as we realized that the entity was not a mere haunting. It was a violent, predatory force determined to eradicate those who dared challenge its dominion. With heavy hearts and trembling resolve, Mia, Jason, and I retreated to the relative safety of the decrepit cabin. The journal, now our only guide, spoke of a ritual that could force the entity into temporary retreat. It was a desperate plan, born out of ancient lore and our collective determination to survive. Inside the cabin, time seemed to stretch into an endless, oppressive night. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of moonlight that filtered through broken windows, and every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of the many souls that had once met their fate in this cursed place. Mia, with a trembling voice, recounted the journal's instructions. We were to locate certain relics, items imbued with the old power of the land, and perform a ritual at the site where the witch had once practiced her dark arts. Only then, it claimed, could we hope to banish the entity, even if only temporarily. The next day, we scoured the area around the cabin, guided by the cryptic notes in the journal. I found a weathered stone inscribed with symbols matching those carved into the trees, while Mia uncovered a rusted ceremonial dagger half buried near a fallen log. Jason, always the resourceful one, managed to retrieve a tattered piece of cloth from the cabin that bore the faded emblem of the indigenous tribe whose legends were entwined with the curse. With these relics in hand, we prepared ourselves for what would be the most dangerous confrontation of our lives. Night fell again, and we returned to the clearing with our gathered items. The air was electric with anticipation, the forest eerily silent save for the occasional distant cry that sent shivers down my spine. I arranged the relics on the ground as described in the journal, drawing a crude but purposeful circle. Mia began the incantation, her voice soft yet resonant, carrying ancient words that seemed to vibrate in the cool air. Jason and I stood guard, our senses straining for any sign of the malevolent force. The moment felt suspended between hope and despair, the forest holding its breath as if witnessing an age-old battle between light and darkness. Almost immediately, the temperature dropped further, and the shadows seemed to coalesce around the circle. From the depths of the forest emerged the entity, its form shifting violently between that of a spectral figure in a flowing, tattered white dress and the hulking, bestial shape of the Wendigo. I felt its eyes bore into my soul, a mixture of sorrow, malice, and ancient rage. The ritual reached its crescendo as Mia's voice rose in defiance of the dark, and the relics glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. For a brief, excruciating moment, it seemed as if our combined will might prevail. The entity howled, a sound that was both human and beast, and recoiled, as if in pain. The force of the incantation forced it to retreat back into the shadows, its presence diminishing until it finally vanished into the night. In that moment of bittersweet victory, we knew that although we had driven it away temporarily, the curse would forever linger in these cursed woods. The aftermath of that night left us forever changed. We buried Lucas in a quiet clearing, a makeshift memorial marked by a simple wooden cross. His loss was a stark reminder of the price we had paid for our curiosity and our defiance of ancient powers. The remaining scars, both physical and emotional, would be with us for the rest of our lives. Mia, her eyes haunted by the visions of what we had faced, vowed never to ignore her intuition again. Jason, who had once deflected terror with humor, now carried a solemn determination that belied his once light-hearted nature. I returned to Des Moines a changed woman, burdened with the weight of our shared nightmare. The Deora woods, with their dark legends and ancient curses, had claimed a part of me. And every time I closed my eyes, I could still see Lucas's desperate face, hear the chilling laughter of unseen children, and feel the cold grip of that malevolent presence. Even now, when the autumn wind rustles through the trees, I recall those long, dreadful nights. The encounter with the entity, a blend of indigenous lore and a witch's curse, taught me that some mysteries are best left unexplored, some powers best left undisturbed. Survival, I learned, isn't just about outlasting the physical hardships. It's about confronting the darkness that dwells in both the world and within ourselves. As I sit here writing these words, I wonder if the entity still roams the Deora woodlands, waiting for the next unwary soul to wander too far into its domain. The memory of that cold, oppressive night. The sound of spectral laughter and the sight of shifting shadows remain vivid, a permanent scar on my soul. I carry the lessons of that harrowing experience with me every day, a reminder that the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and that sometimes, in the quiet solitude of nature, the past refuses to remain buried. This experience, as dreadful as it was transformative, left me with an unshakable resolve to seek the truth behind every legend, to respect the ancient forces that still linger in forgotten places, and to never again dismiss the intuitive whispers of warning that come from deep within. For those who dare to venture into the unknown, remember that the greatest danger often lies not in what you expect, but in what lurks unseen in the shadows. I am Amber Reyes, and my journey into the heart of darkness has irrevocably altered my path. Lucas's absence is a constant reminder of the price of curiosity, and every night, as I watch the shadows lengthen across my walls, I know that somewhere in the vast, mysterious woods of Iowa, an ancient evil waits, ever hungry, ever vengeful, and ever ready to reclaim its dominion over the living. In the quiet moments of reflection, I find solace in the strength I've discovered within myself and in the memory of those who walked beside me. The Deora woods remain a testament to the enduring power of old curses and the resilience of the human spirit. And though the terror of that night may fade with time, its lessons and its scars will forever be etched into my very being. My name is Nathan Cole, and I am 45 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2023, when I decided to leave behind the chaos of my past and seek solace along the banks of the Wapsipinicon River in Iowa. I'd spent years haunted by a personal tragedy, a loss that still gnawed at my soul, and I believed that a long solitary RV trip into the remote woods might finally give me the space to confront the demons within. I set out in my old RV, a battered vehicle that had seen better days, with nothing but a few belongings, a stack of paperbacks, and a determination to find some semblance of peace. As I drove through the slowly darkening Iowa landscape, the golden hues of fall gave way to deepening shadows, and a chill crept in, foreshadowing the eerie solitude that awaited me. After hours on winding roads and overgrown highways, I arrived at a secluded clearing along the river. The campsite was remote, nestled among dense stands of towering pines, with a nearly forgotten abandoned building standing off to one side, a relic of a bygone era. I parked my RV in a small flat area where the mist from the river could easily roll in at night, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange blend of hope and foreboding. That first night, as I settled into the creaking confines of my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I sat huddled by a small, battery-operated lantern, trying to ignore the soft, almost imperceptible giggles that seemed to echo through the stillness of the surrounding woods. At first, I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down I sensed that something was not right. In the early hours before dawn, I stepped outside to investigate. The cool air stung my face as I noticed something peculiar near the RV. Small, delicate footprints in the damp earth that led directly toward the riverbank. They were too tiny and precise to belong to any animal I could recognize. On several nearby trees, I also found strange markings, a series of cryptic symbols carved with a care that suggested both Native American motifs and archaic, almost ritualistic runes. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if these signs were calling to me, urging me to look deeper into the mystery of this place. My days at the campsite were spent in a state of cautious routine. I repaired what I could on the RV. Its lights flickered unpredictably, and the radio only emitted unsettling static interspersed with what sounded like distant, mournful sobbing. At night, the fog would roll in thick from the river, shrouding everything in a ghostly haze. In that obscurity, the landscape became a canvas for my darkest fears. One afternoon, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain, I wandered toward the abandoned building by the river, a weathered structure that seemed to have been abandoned for decades. Its broken windows and creaking doorways whispered of secrets long buried. Inside, amid scattered debris and remnants of old furniture, I discovered a box of old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. The clippings told a heartbreaking tale, a local tragedy of a child who had died mysteriously along the banks of the Wapsipinicon many years ago. The headlines were faded, the dates blurred by time, but the story was unmistakable. A community shattered by a loss that some whispered had been cursed by an ancient, malevolent force. Among the handwritten notes, I found a faded photograph of the child, a small, innocent face that seemed to gaze out at me with hollow eyes, as if pleading for justice or release. Tucked beneath the photo was a small token, a tiny silver locket that had clearly seen better days. As I held it in my hand, I felt a surge of emotion that I couldn't quite place. It was as if the relic had absorbed the sorrow and despair of the past, and now it reached out to me, bridging the gap between then and now. That evening, as dusk fell and the world turned to shadow, the first true manifestation of the supernatural made itself known. I was sitting alone by the RV's open door, staring into the dense fog that was rolling in from the river, when I caught sight of something at the very edge of my vision. A spectral figure, a child, no older than 7, drifted silently among the trees. The figure's eyes were empty and sorrowful, and its presence sent a jolt of terror straight through me. I blinked, and the apparition vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a soft, despairing cry that seemed to float on the wind. The following night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I lay awake, listening as the fog pressed closer against the sides of the RV and the distant sound of laughter, childlike and unnervingly hollow, drifted through the dark. At one point I distinctly heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling my name, Nathan. It was a sound that seemed to come from both within the RV and from the very earth beneath my feet. I forced myself to sit up, heart pounding, and scanned the darkness with a trembling flashlight. But there was nothing, only the oppressive, unyielding night. As the days wore on, the supernatural events intensified. The footprints reappeared nightly, always leading toward the river, as if inviting me to follow them. The strange symbols on the trees grew more numerous, their meaning elusive yet menacing. I began to notice that the technical glitches in the RV were growing more frequent. The lights would dim and then surge, The radio would suddenly cut to a chilling static punctuated by what sounded like a child's cry, and the temperature inside the RV would drop so rapidly that my breath became visible. I tried to maintain my composure, clinging to the hope that my logical mind could explain everything away, but the isolation, compounded by the relentless, eerie phenomena, began to wear on me. I started questioning my own sanity. Had the solitude of the wilderness stirred old memories, or was something else at play? Was the tragedy of the past somehow linked to my own inner torment? One particularly foggy night, I resolved to confront the mysteries head-on. I gathered the relics I had found in the abandoned building, the faded photograph of the child and the silver locket, and, with a trembling resolve, I stepped out into the murky darkness. The fog was thick as a shroud, and the full moon was hidden behind a wall of swirling clouds. I made my way to a small clearing near the riverbank where the footprints converged. There, in the center of the clearing, I arranged the relics as if performing a makeshift altar. A ritual of redemption and closure, born out of desperation and an unexplainable connection to the tragic past. I recalled the notes and clippings from the abandoned building, piecing together a narrative of sorrow and cursed misfortune. The child, it seemed, had been a victim not only of human loss, but of an ancient malevolence that had haunted the banks of the Wapsipinicon for generations. The writing spoke of a cursed spirit, an echo of despair and retribution that preyed upon the vulnerable, drawing them into a cycle of grief and guilt. As I stood there, the chill of the night deepened, and I felt as if unseen eyes were fixed upon me. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, and with it came a soft, plaintive cry, a sound that echoed with both anguish and malice. I could see through the shifting mist the spectral figure of the child emerging fully into view. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its small form trembled as if caught between worlds. For a moment, time seemed to slow as I stared into that gaze, and I felt a powerful surge of sorrow, as if the child's own grief was an extension of my own buried pain. The apparition moved toward me with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. I tried to back away, but the fog and the oppressive atmosphere left me rooted to the spot. The child's cry grew louder, and I realized that it was not merely a plea for help. It was a call to confront the darkness that had claimed it. In that moment, I understood that this spirit was not a benign presence, but a cursed, malevolent force. The entity's sorrow was laced with a dangerous edge, a warning that its tragic past had fermented into a vengeful wrath. Panic surged within me as the spectral child extended a ghostly hand toward the river. The air around us thickened, and the ground trembled with an unseen force. I heard a low, resonant sound, like the distant roar of a troubled spirit, and felt an irresistible pull, as if the entity was trying to drag me into the icy depths of the river's embrace. My logical mind screamed that this was impossible, that it was all a trick of the mind fueled by isolation and grief, yet my body reacted with a primal terror that left me paralyzed. Summoning every ounce of strength and resolve, I clutched the silver locket and the faded photograph as if they were talismans against the encroaching darkness. I began to speak softly, words of forgiveness and release, the very sentiments I had long suppressed. "I forgive you," I whispered, first to the lost child, then to myself, for the burdens of guilt that had chained me to a past I could not change. My voice, though shaky at first, grew steadier with each word, a personal incantation against the malevolence that threatened to overwhelm me. The spectral child paused, its formless features contorting between despair and something akin to relief. The air around me shifted, and for a heartbeat the oppressive force receded. I felt the pull diminish, replaced by a fragile calm. Yet, even as I clung to that fleeting respite, I knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The entity's presence lingered in the mist, a dark, ever-watchful force waiting for another moment of vulnerability. In the following hours I remained in the clearing, the relics still arranged before me as if guarding some ancient secret. The fog slowly lifted as dawn broke, revealing a river that flowed quietly but with an undercurrent of something powerful and unpredictable. My hands trembled as I retrieved the relics, and I vowed silently that I would carry the memory of that night with me, both as a reminder of my inner battles and as a warning of the lingering curse that haunted these banks. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Was the malevolent spirit truly appeased by my act of redemption, or had I merely delayed the inevitable return of the cursed presence? As I packed up my few belongings and prepared to leave the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was watching me from the edges of the clearing, its sorrowful eyes forever etched in my memory. Driving away along the winding road, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The isolation of the wapsipinicon had forced me to confront not only the supernatural, but also the inner turmoil that had long plagued me. I realized that the journey had been as much about self-forgiveness as it had been about facing an ancient curse. In the quiet solitude of my RV, with only the distant murmur of the river and the whisper of the wind for company, I began to understand that healing was a process, a slow, painful confrontation with the darkest corners of one's soul. As the landscape gradually transformed from dense woods to open fields, I allowed myself a moment of introspection. I thought of the spectral child, its tragic visage a mirror of the sorrow that lay hidden within me. I knew that I could not undo the past, that some wounds never fully heal, but perhaps I could learn to live with them. I had faced a malevolent force that was as old as the land itself, and in doing so I had come to accept that some curses are not meant to be entirely vanquished. They are to be understood, acknowledged, and, if possible, softened by the light of compassion and forgiveness. Even now, long after I left that forsaken campsite, I sometimes hear the echo of that child's cry in the quiet moments of twilight. The experience remains a bittersweet memory, a reminder that the greatest battles we face are not always fought with weapons or incantations, but with the courage to confront our own inner darkness. I am Nathan Cole, and my journey along the banks of the Wapsipinicon River reshaped me in ways I never expected. The encounter with that cursed spirit, a manifestation of deep-seated sorrow and ancient malevolence, taught me that healing comes at the cost of facing our deepest fears. As I continue on my path, I carry with me the lessons of that autumn night, that redemption is possible even in the face of overwhelming despair, and that sometimes the only way to break a cycle of pain is to forgive, not just others, but ourselves. Driving back toward civilization, the haunting beauty of Iowa's autumn landscapes accompanied me, their brilliant colors a stark contrast to the darkness I had experienced. I knew that the scars of that night would remain with me, a permanent reminder of the power of isolation, guilt, and the enduring need for self-forgiveness. And yet, there was also a fragile hope, a belief that by facing the ghosts of our past, we can emerge stronger, more compassionate, and ultimately more whole. That solitary RV trip, born out of a desperate search for healing, became a journey into the heart of sorrow and redemption. The memories of that cursed place, the spectral child, and the oppressive fog that rolled in from the river are forever woven into the tapestry of my life. I no longer fear the darkness that lies in wait, for I have seen that even in the bleakest shadows, there is a glimmer of light. A reminder that, despite the relentless pull of despair, the human spirit can find its way back to hope. And so, as I drive onward into the uncertain future, I remain ever vigilant, mindful of the delicate balance between the past and the present, between sorrow and redemption. The Wapsipinicon River may still whisper its mournful secrets in the night, but I have learned that, sometimes, facing those whispers head-on is the first step toward healing. This is my story, a solitary journey of confronting not only a cursed spirit born of ancient tragedy, but also the hidden burdens of my own heart. I am Nathan Cole, and while the scars of that autumn night will never fully fade, they serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of forgiveness. My name is Cassandra Monroe, and I am 38 years old. This happened in the late autumn of 2023, when I left the chaos of Des Moines behind in my old, creaking RV, determined to uncover the truth behind a series of disappearances in rural Iowa, a mystery that has haunted these backroads for decades and is deeply intertwined with my own past. My brother vanished under baffling circumstances years ago, and ever since I've chased every lead, every whispered conspiracy, hoping to find answers. I believed that if I could piece together the secrets hidden in the isolated corners of this state, perhaps I could finally find closure. The road out of the city was long and lonesome, the highway stretching into endless fields and dense, quiet woodlands. I had packed my trusty camera, a voice recorder, notebooks filled with scribbled theories, and, most importantly, a battered CB radio that had a habit of crackling with strange, static-laden messages. My RV, though charmingly worn, was unreliable at best. The power would flicker, and the engine's growl sometimes sounded like it was protesting each mile. But I pressed on, fueled by the dual fires of determination and desperation. After hours of driving, I arrived at the outskirts of a tiny, secretive town near Elk Horn, Iowa. The area was a patchwork of dense forests, abandoned farmhouses, and silent, weather-beaten roads that seemed to guard decades of secrets. The autumn sun was low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows through a persistent mist that clung to the ground. I parked my RV on a lonely patch of land, where the rustle of falling leaves and the distant murmur of the wind were the only sounds accompanying me. There was a chill in the air that went beyond the season, a pervasive feeling of isolation that seeped into my bones. That very night, as I settled into the cramped interior of my RV, I tuned into my CB radio to distract myself from the oppressive quiet. The static was unusually intense, and amid the hiss, I began to pick up fragmented snippets of what sounded like a distress call, a series of cryptic numbers, urgent warnings, and desperate pleas that made my heart race. I scribbled the fragments into my notebook, wondering if this was merely interference or something far more sinister. Every time I heard a burst of static, it felt like the voice of someone or something calling out from the void. The next morning, driven by equal parts curiosity and the need for answers, I set out on foot to explore the nearby area. I stumbled upon an old, deserted barn on the edge of a long-forgotten farmstead. Its weathered boards creaked in the gentle breeze, and the scent of decay and history was overwhelming. Inside, scattered among broken tools and faded hay bales, I discovered a poster pinned to a rotting wall. It featured the smiling face of a missing local teenager, a haunting image that struck me with an inexplicable familiarity. The poster, yellowed with age, seemed to silently mourn a lost life, and I couldn't help but think of my brother, how every disappearance, every unanswered question echoed my own heartache. In the following days, I frequented the small town's sparse library and spoke with the few locals who would meet my probing questions. Their eyes, wary and guarded, hinted at secrets they weren't willing to share freely. In hushed tones, they recounted eerie tales from the 1980s, Stories of a covert group that dabbled in experimental radio technology, of government projects that had mysteriously vanished into secrecy, and of a series of disappearances that coincided with strange signals emanating from a long decommissioned radio tower. I listened intently, recording every detail with my voice recorder, while my mind raced with the implications of these whispered accounts. One elderly man, his voice trembling with age and regret, told me about an abandoned facility on a sprawling farm just outside of town. According to him, the facility once housed secret experiments designed to manipulate radio frequencies and, disturbingly, to tamper with human consciousness. He spoke of files, scattered reports, and personal notes that hinted at a dark chapter in the region's history, a chapter where identities were erased and lives inexplicably snuffed out. The more he spoke, the more I felt a connection between these grim stories and the static-filled transmissions on my CB radio. That night, back in my RV, the static on the radio intensified. The voices became clearer, as if struggling to break free from some unseen barrier. I heard desperate pleas for help, warnings in a distorted tone, and even the faint sound of a child's cry mingled with the static. Outside, the mist thickened, and strange lights flickered among the trees as if guiding or warning me. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of shadowy figures moving just beyond the reach of my headlights on the gravel road, and my rational mind battled with a rising tide of paranoia. Was I simply imagining these things, or were the secrets of this place reaching out to me? Unable to shake the sense of foreboding, I decided to follow the trail of clues. Armed with my camera and the fragments of stories I'd gathered, I made my way to the abandoned facility described by the locals. The building was a hulking relic of industrial decay. Rusted machinery lay scattered about, and crumbling walls whispered of years of neglect. Inside, I found piles of old files, yellowed reports, and personal notes that painted a chilling picture. Experimental equipment designed to manipulate radio frequencies had been used to probe and disturb the human mind. The documents hinted that some of the experiments went horribly wrong, erasing identities and leaving behind a trail of disappearances that the government had desperately tried to cover up. As I rummaged through the evidence, I heard footsteps echoing in the vast, empty corridors. My heart pounded as I turned a corner and came face to face with a grizzled man in threadbare clothes. His eyes, though wary, held a depth of sorrow and defiance. He introduced himself as Daniel, a former whistleblower who had once worked at the facility. With a voice heavy with regret, he explained that the experiments had indeed altered minds, erased people from existence, and spawned a cycle of disappearances that had plagued the region for decades. Daniel warned me that digging too deeply could put me in the crosshairs of forces that would stop at nothing to silence the truth. His words, laced with both caution and conviction, resonated with me. This was no mere local legend, but a dark reality that stretched back into the very heart of the region's history. Overwhelmed by the enormity of what I had discovered, I retreated to my RV to process everything. The night grew darker, the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. My CB radio crackled incessantly with the now familiar static, and I realized that the signals were not random at all. They were a coded message, a desperate communication from the past, pleading to be heard. With renewed determination, I resolved to expose the truth. I couldn't let these stories, these lost lives, fade into obscurity. I had to broadcast what I had found, not only for the sake of the missing, but also to confront the demons of my own past. The following evening, a violent storm descended upon the area. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and sheets of rain pounded the roof of my RV. I drove to the edge of the facility, where an old, decrepit radio tower still stood, a relic from a time when these experiments were conducted in the open. I knew that if I were to reach anyone, if I were to break the cycle of silence, I had to use that tower to broadcast my findings live. I gathered my equipment, the camera, the voice recorder, and every document and recording I'd managed to compile, and made my way to the base of the tower. The tower loomed in the storm, its metal structure creaking as the wind howled around it. I set up my makeshift broadcasting station atop the tower, the elements battering me from every side. The static on my radio surged with an almost sentient urgency, merging with the roar of the storm. With trembling fingers, I keyed the microphone and began my live broadcast, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of rain and wind. I recounted everything: the government cover-ups, the experimental facility, the documents I had uncovered, and the desperate transmissions on the CB radio. I spoke of my brother, of the personal loss that had driven me to pursue this dangerous truth, and of the chilling evidence that these disappearances were not isolated incidents, but part of a far-reaching conspiracy. As I broadcast, the static seemed to respond, morphing into a garbled, haunting message that reverberated through the air, as if coming from beyond the veil of time. In that moment, I felt as though the voices of the past were joining me, urging me to press on. But the storm was far from over. Out of the swirling darkness, I saw them, shadowy figures emerging at the periphery of my vision. At first, I thought they were tricks of the light, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching. My heart pounded as I realized I was not alone atop the tower. In the midst of my broadcast, as I tried to relay every piece of evidence for the world to hear, unidentified assailants descended from the darkness. Cloaked in shadow and moving with a terrifying silence, they converged on the tower with one goal: to silence me and bury the truth once and for all. Chaos erupted as I fumbled to secure my equipment. The wind and rain became a blur, and every second was a desperate struggle between exposing the truth and the imminent threat of violence. I ducked behind the rusted control panel, my voice recorder clutched tightly in one hand as I fought to keep the broadcast alive. Fists struck and shouts mingled with the relentless static. The attackers were relentless, their movements coordinated and coldly efficient. In the midst of the turmoil, I managed to record every detail: the sound of shattering glass, the muffled thud of bodies hitting the metal platform, and my own ragged breaths as I tried to maintain control of the situation. I knew I had to make a choice. The whistleblower's warnings, Daniel's words, and the damning evidence I had uncovered all converged into a single, horrifying narrative. The experiments had not only tampered with technology, but had tampered with humanity itself. Lives were being erased, identities wiped clean, and anyone who dared speak out was met with swift, brutal retribution. Faced with this terrible truth, I had two options: risk everything by transmitting the full, unedited story live, even if it meant confronting these unknown forces head-on, or retreat and compile the evidence to plan a counterstrike against the powerful forces determined to silence the truth forever. In that heart-stopping moment, with the storm raging around me and the attackers closing in, I made my decision. With my voice hoarse and adrenaline surging, I continued to broadcast. Every detail of what I had uncovered spilled out into the stormy night. I called out to anyone listening, pleading for help and promising that the truth would not be buried. The static on the radio swelled, carrying my words into the void as if they were a beacon in the darkness. The struggle lasted only minutes, though they felt like an eternity. Amid a final surge of chaos, I managed to fend off the attackers long enough for the broadcast to reach a wider audience. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the tower's power flickered and went dark. The last thing I heard was the fading echo of my own voice, mingling with the relentless static, and then silence. I don't know how I escaped that night. One moment I was clinging to life on a creaking radio tower amid a violent storm, and the next I found myself back in my battered RV, its engine miraculously still running. My hands were raw, and my body ached from the struggle, but I had survived. I gathered what evidence I could salvage from the chaos, the recordings, the documents, every scrap of truth I had managed to preserve, and drove away from that haunted place. In the days that followed, I remained in a state of limbo. The broadcast had cut off abruptly, and I wasn't sure how much of my evidence had reached the outside world. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, a profound transformation took root within me. I realized that my quest for the truth was only just beginning. The encounter on that storm-lashed night forced me to confront not only the dark forces that had been silenced, but also the ghosts of my own past, the unsolved disappearance of my brother, and the lingering guilt that had driven me to these dangerous lengths. The town of Elk Horn remained shrouded in mystery, its residents returning to their guarded silence as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The static on my CB radio would occasionally flare up again as I drove the lonely roads back towards civilization, a haunting reminder that the forces behind those secret experiments were still at work, and that my battle against them was far from over. Every night, as I sit in the quiet solitude of my RV and listen to the soft hum of the engine mingled with the occasional burst of static, I can still hear the echoes of that night. The desperate pleas of the voices, the thunder of footsteps, and the final resounding call for truth. I carry the weight of that experience with me, a constant reminder of the cost of uncovering secrets that some would kill to keep hidden. Now, I continue my work as an investigative journalist with a renewed sense of purpose. I know that the journey ahead will be fraught with peril, that my every step might be shadowed by those determined to silence the truth. But I also know that I cannot and will not turn back. My brother's disappearance, the missing teenager on that faded poster, and every life erased by those unholy experiments demand justice. The story is far from over, and I intend to see it through to the bitter end. My name is Cassandra Monroe, and I am 38 years old. I have seen the dark underbelly of rural Iowa, a place where secrets fester, where the static of the past speaks in fragmented whispers, and where truth is a fragile flame battling against a relentless storm. I escaped that night, but the battle continues. And as long as there are voices calling out from the shadows, I will be there to listen, to record, and to expose the darkness for all the world to see. Even now, as I drive away from the silent, eerie town of Elk Horn with a trove of damning evidence by my side, I can't shake the feeling that the static isn't done with me yet. In the quiet moments between the hum of the engine and the whispered wind, I catch a fleeting glimpse of something, a shadow, a voice, a promise that the forces behind those experiments are still watching. And I know that I must be ready, for the truth has a way of echoing back, louder and more insistent than ever before. This is my story, a tale of isolation, of hidden truths, and of a relentless pursuit for justice in the face of overwhelming darkness. And while the road ahead is uncertain, I walk it with my eyes wide open, determined to shine a light on the secrets that have long been buried in the static of shadows. My name is Dylan Mills, and I am 42 years old. This happened in the late summer of 2023, when I left behind the relentless noise of Des Moines in my old RV, seeking refuge in the rugged isolation of the Loess Hills. I was a burnt-out software engineer, burdened by the grief of my father's recent passing and the weight of unresolved regrets. I hoped that escaping into nature, away from digital screens and ceaseless notifications, might help me rediscover meaning and maybe even heal. The drive out of the city was strangely cathartic. As I merged onto long, empty highways, the modern world receded, replaced by endless fields, rolling prairies, and the peculiar wind-sculpted cliffs of the Loess Hills. The landscape was bathed in a golden light that lent everything a surreal, almost timeless quality. I parked my battered RV on a gentle rise overlooking the prairie. From that vantage point I could see for miles, an undulating sea of tall grasses and distant, crumbling hills. I set up camp with a mixture of technical precision and weary resignation, determined to spend the next few days alone with my thoughts and my work. The first few days passed in an odd state of quiet routine. I spent my mornings scribbling in a journal, my afternoons tinkering with my laptop to write code and document my observations, and my evenings watching the sunset bleed into dusk. Yet, as I settled into this solitude, small but unsettling anomalies began to disturb my fragile sense of peace. It started with my digital clock. I noticed, with a flicker of disbelief, that the time on my devices seemed to glitch intermittently. At first, I dismissed it as a simple software bug or a low battery issue, but then I observed something even stranger. Every day, at precisely 6:47 p.m., I would hear the same sequence of bird calls, and a knock would echo from the RV door, a knock that sounded as if it were recorded and replayed exactly each time. I began to feel an eerie déjà vu, as if I were trapped in a loop, reliving the same minute over and over without any control. Determined to understand what was happening, I set up a makeshift logging system. I rigged an old digital camera to take snapshots every minute and used a notepad to record every detail with precise timestamps. My technical skills, honed from years of debugging code, became my lifeline. I soon discovered that not only the clock but many elements of my daily routine were repeating with uncanny precision. A conversation I had with a local hiker at a nearby trail, the rustling of leaves outside the RV at a particular interval, even the way the wind shifted direction. It all repeated exactly, as if time itself had become a broken record. One afternoon, while exploring a narrow trail near my campsite, I found something that deepened the mystery. Carved into the face of a weathered rock was a series of cryptic symbols. The marks were intricate and oddly familiar, reminiscent of designs I'd seen in old family photographs and even in the faded patterns of my father's old watch, a watch I had always regretted not cherishing more. The connection unsettled me, stirring memories of my father's quiet wisdom and the guilt that had plagued me since his passing. Later that evening, as I returned to my RV, the sense of repetition had grown oppressive. I felt as if I were moving through a scene that had been carefully set up for a play, one that I couldn't change no matter how hard I tried. I sat by the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, and noted in my journal, the same colors, the same shadows, the same fleeting moment of perfect stillness. I wondered if my grief was distorting my perception or if something more inexplicable was at work. That night, the loop intensified. I awoke to the sound of a knock at exactly 6:47 p.m., just as before. I opened the door expecting the same empty darkness, but instead I saw a flash of movement. A shadow that seemed to melt into the twilight before disappearing entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by an unseen presence that existed between moments. The next day, I dedicated myself to understanding the loop. I spent hours poring over the snapshots on my camera, comparing minute details to see if anything ever truly changed. Every image was identical. A landscape frozen in a single frame of time. In desperation, I even tried to force a deviation by deliberately altering my routine, but each attempt was met with the same eerie repetition. My world was caught in a relentless cycle, and I was trapped at its center. One late afternoon, as a crimson sunset bathed the hills in a surreal glow, I decided to take a different route back to my RV. I followed a narrow path that led me past an abandoned farmhouse, a relic of another time, its paint peeling and windows darkened by years of neglect. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, I entered the building. Inside, dust motes danced in the light from a broken window, and scattered remnants of a life long gone lay in disarray. Amid the debris, I discovered an old, tattered journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting spidery and urgent. The journal recounted a local legend of an ancient force said to reside in the Low S Hills, a force that could bend time and trap souls in a never-ending loop. The entries hinted at rituals of self-forgiveness and acceptance, suggesting that the only way to break free was to confront one's deepest regrets. The final entry was the most chilling of all. It spoke of a spectral presence that manifested at the edge of perception, a guardian of time who challenged those who dared disturb its domain. I clutched the journal, my heart pounding as I realized that the story was not merely folklore. It was as if the ancient force was reaching out to me, linking the recurring loop to my own internal struggles, my grief, my guilt, and the unresolved issues surrounding my father's death. The symbols carved into the rock outside now took on a new meaning, and I knew that my only chance to break the cycle was to confront these buried emotions head-on. As dusk fell on what felt like the 100th repetition of the day, I prepared myself for the confrontation I sensed was inevitable. I sat in my RV, recording a video diary as I laid out the evidence of the loop and the connection to my past. "I'm trapped in time," I said into the camera, my voice raw with emotion. "Every moment is a reminder of the things I failed to resolve. I've been living in a loop, both in time and in the shadows of my regrets." I paused, staring into the lens as if daring the unseen force to challenge me. That night, the anomalies grew even more pronounced. The digital clock on my dashboard began to flicker wildly, and every device in the RV, my laptop, my phone, even the old radio, emitted bursts of static. I sensed a change in the atmosphere, as if the world around me were thinning at the edges. At precisely 6:47 p.m., I felt a chill deeper than any autumn night, and a spectral figure materialized at the edge of my vision. It was a translucent form, shifting and undefined, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intensity. The figure did not speak, yet its presence was laden with an unspoken challenge, a demand that I confront the truth I had been avoiding. Paralyzed by a mix of terror and resolve, I stepped out of the RV and approached the apparition. My mind raced with questions. Who were you? What do you want from me? Yet, even as my voice faltered, I sensed that this was not an enemy to be fought, but a manifestation of the force that held me captive, a mirror reflecting my innermost self. The figure's eyes seemed to implore me to let go of the past, to accept the pain and move forward. In that moment, memories of my father surged forth, his quiet strength, the moments we shared in silence, and the regret of words left unspoken. Tears streamed down my face as I realized that my struggle was not with an external enemy, but with the ghosts of my own guilt. I sank to my knees and whispered words of forgiveness, both to my father and to myself. "I forgive you," I murmured, voice trembling, "and I forgive myself." As the words left my lips, a palpable shift occurred. The spectral figure paused, its form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. For a long, suspended moment, the world held its breath. I felt the oppressive weight of the loop begin to ease, as if a door had been unlocked in the fabric of time itself. The relentless repetition, the digital glitches, and the eerie déjà vu all began to blur and fade into a murmur of what had been. The following morning, I awoke to a sunrise that felt different, hopeful, almost liberating. I checked my digital clock and saw that the anomalies were gone. The time now flowed normally, the routine unbroken by the strange insistent echoes of yesterday. I ventured outside, and the Loess Hills stretched out before me, bathed in the warm glow of a new day. The carved symbols on the rock remained, silent witnesses to the ordeal, but now they seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, as if acknowledging my newfound acceptance. I spent the day reflecting on the experience, poring over the journal I had found and examining the evidence I had collected. The loop had been more than a supernatural trap. It had been a mirror, forcing me to confront the pain I had long buried. I realized that the force controlling the loop was not an external curse to be fought with technology or brute force, but a natural consequence of my inner turmoil. Only by reconciling with my past could I hope to break free from the cycle. In the weeks that followed, I continued my journey through the Loess Hills with a cautious optimism. I kept the journal and the carved symbols as reminders of the ordeal and the lesson I had learned. That time is fluid, and that the scars of the past need not define the future. I even began documenting my experience on a blog, sharing the story of the loop and the strange silent guardian that had compelled me to face my regrets. The response was slow at first, but gradually others reached out with their own tales of unexplainable phenomena and the healing power of acceptance. Every so often, when the wind rustles through the tall grasses or the sky flashes with an unexpected brilliance, I am reminded of that night. The moment when time itself had bent to the will of my heart's sorrow and subsequent release. I have learned that some mysteries of the natural world are intertwined with our own internal landscapes, that the line between the supernatural and our own emotional experiences is often blurred. The Loess Hills, with their timeless beauty and hidden depths, have taught me that healing is not about escaping the past, but about embracing it, learning from it, and ultimately letting it go. Today, as I drive my RV along a quiet back road, I no longer feel trapped in a cycle of regret. Instead, I carry with me the wisdom of that transformative experience, a deep understanding that every moment, no matter how repetitive or painful it may seem, holds the potential for change. The digital glitches and the eerie déjà vu are now distant echoes, reminders of a time when I was forced to confront the shadow of my own sorrow. I continue my journey with a cautious hope, aware that the natural world still holds many mysteries that defy simple explanation. But I am no longer afraid of what lies beyond the veil of routine. I have learned to listen to the whispers of the wind, to appreciate the silent lessons of the earth, and to trust that even in the midst of the most relentless loops, there is always a chance for redemption. My name is Dylan Mills, and at 42, I have discovered that sometimes the most profound adventures are not the ones that take us to far-off lands, but the journeys that force us to confront our own hearts. The Loess Hills will always be a place of mystery and beauty, a reminder that time, like life, is ever-changing, and that true freedom comes from the courage to embrace both the light and the darkness within. This is my story of being trapped in a loop and finally breaking free, not through extraordinary feats of heroism or technological wizardry, but through the simple, transformative act of self-forgiveness. And as I continue to navigate the winding roads of Iowa, I know that while the past may always echo in the corners of my mind, the future is a horizon of endless possibility waiting to be discovered. My name is James Jamie Caldwell, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in late August 2023, when I decided to leave behind a life full of regret and heartache in search of solace, and perhaps a connection to a past that might help mend my broken present. I was once a high school history teacher passionate about the stories of those who came before me. But after a painful breakup and a series of missed opportunities, my career and personal life crumbled, leaving me adrift in a sea of what-ifs. Desperate for a fresh start, I loaded up my aging RV with nothing more than a few essentials, my well-worn notebook, and a burning curiosity about history, and headed toward the historic Amana colonies in Iowa. The drive was long and contemplative. I remember the endless ribbon of highway stretching beneath a golden August sun, bordered by fields that whispered secrets of seasons past. My thoughts drifted back to the days when I would stand before my classroom, sharing stories of pioneering communities and bygone eras, and I longed to recapture that passion. The RV, a clunky, reliable relic that had carried me through better days, chugged along steadily, even as its old digital clock began to glitch, resetting itself to times that no longer existed. I brushed it off as a quirk of an old machine, unaware that it was only the first hint of what awaited me. I arrived at my destination in the late afternoon. Nestled among a tangle of overgrown paths and quietly maintained historic buildings, my chosen campsite lay on a secluded plot adjacent to a well-preserved communal structure within the Amana colonies. The area was a beautiful blend of old-world charm and the relentless creep of nature reclaiming its space. Moss-covered stone walls, a forgotten meeting house draped in ivy, and the lingering aroma of wood smoke and earth. I parked my RV in a small clearing and set about unloading my gear, feeling both the thrill of escape and the pull of a history I'd long cherished. That first night, as dusk fell and the ancient buildings took on deep, mysterious shadows, I began to notice unsettling anomalies. The digital clock in my RV inexplicably reset itself to an earlier time, a time I couldn't quite place. My radio, which I had intended to use to catch local news, instead tuned into old broadcasts, snippets of music and news bulletins that seemed to belong to decades past. I tried to adjust the dials, but the interference was relentless, and a chill of unease crept over me. I dismissed it as mere technical glitches, remnants of an old machine's decay, but deep down, I knew something was different this time. The following morning, while rummaging through a small drawer in a forgotten corner of the RV, I discovered a weathered diary bound in cracked leather. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a soft, almost ghostly hue. The diary was not mine, and its entries were dated long after the colonies had been abandoned as a communal living experiment. In it, an unknown colonist wrote of strange happenings, of time slipping away, of voices echoing from the past, and of an unexplainable urge to unlock the past and bridge the gap between then and now. The final entries were cryptic instructions, as if urging the reader to seek out a hidden truth buried somewhere within the colony's relics. I felt a strange connection to the words on those pages, as if the diary had been waiting for me. That evening, as I sat outside my RV listening to the symphony of cicadas and the distant murmur of a breeze through ancient trees, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Soft footsteps on gravel, like those of a long-forgotten procession, resounded in the stillness. Faint voices murmured in a language that was almost but not quite English, a hymn, perhaps, or a prayer. And I stepped out into the cool night air, diary clutched in my hand, and looked toward the overgrown paths. For a fleeting moment, I saw the spectral outline of a figure dressed in period clothing, moving silently among the shadows, only to vanish when I blinked. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and fascination. The past was reaching out to me. In the days that followed, the anomalies only grew more pronounced. My RV's clocks continued to misbehave, sometimes showing modern times, other times reverting to what looked like early 20th century hours. My radio intermittently picked up broadcasts that recounted local events from decades ago, and on several nights I caught glimpses of figures, men and women in old-fashioned attire, appearing in the periphery of my vision as I strolled near my campsite. The diary's entries became my guide, its cryptic instructions urging me to search for a hidden secret in a secluded part of the colony. I began to follow the clues written in the fragile pages of that diary. They pointed me toward an abandoned meeting house on the edge of the colony, a building long rumored to be the epicenter of the strange disturbances that had plagued the area. One crisp morning, I packed a small bag, grabbed my camera and notebook, and set off along a narrow, winding path flanked by ancient trees and overgrown ferns. The air was heavy with history, every rustle of leaves and distant creak of a weathered sign seeming to whisper of forgotten times. As I approached the meeting house, the modern world seemed to blur and fade away. The building loomed before me, a once grand structure now draped in shadows and mystery. Its wooden facade was worn smooth by decades of neglect, and the sound of the wind passing through broken windows was eerily reminiscent of hushed voices reciting an old hymn. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior was a startling blend of decay and timelessness. Flickering shafts of light revealed pews lined up in neat rows, dust motes swirling in the air, and walls adorned with faded murals depicting scenes of communal life from a long-gone era. As I moved deeper into the building, I began to experience a series of jarring shifts. One moment, the room looked as it did today, dim, abandoned, and overgrown with the soft patina of time. The next, it transformed before my eyes into a bustling gathering hall, with colonists in period dress congregating for a solemn meeting. Their expressions were etched with hope and despair, caught in the act of a ritual meant to mend a grievous rupture in time. I froze, heart pounding, as I watched the spectral scene unfold like a film from a forgotten era. It was as if the meeting house itself had become a portal, a temporal nexus where the past and present coexisted in a fragile, ephemeral balance. I realized with a shock that I was no longer a mere observer. I was witnessing a pivotal moment from the colony's history, a moment of ritualistic desperation intended to heal a wound that had never fully closed. I spent what felt like an eternity hidden in the shadows of the meeting house, recording every detail in my notebook and with my camera. The colonists gathered in a circle, their voices low and urgent, as they chanted words I couldn't understand. They clutched relics and symbols of their shared past, and their eyes shone with a mixture of hope and sorrow. The ritual was both beautiful and tragic, a desperate bid to bridge a gap between the time that was and the time that is. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the scene dissolved. The figures faded away, the candlelight dimmed, and the meeting house reverted to its present-day, dilapidated state. Stunned, I sank to the floor amid the dust and echoes of that vanished assembly. In that moment, I understood that the temporal disturbances were not violent or malevolent. They were a mournful echo of a past that had been left unresolved. The diary's final words, the cryptic instructions about unlocking the past, now made sense. I wasn't meant to alter history or change what had happened. I was meant to bear witness, to record and honor the voices of those who had once lived and, perhaps, to finally let them rest. In the days that followed my encounter in the meeting house, I began to document everything. I spent long hours at my campsite, meticulously transcribing the diary's entries alongside my own observations. I even started merging the two, my modern reflections intertwined with the colonists' fading words, creating a tapestry of memory that spanned decades. I found solace in this act of preservation, as if by acknowledging the past I could begin to heal my own wounds. At night, the strange occurrences gradually subsided. The clocks in my RV, which had been so erratic, settled into a steady rhythm. My radio returned to playing local stations without those eerie, out-of-place broadcasts. Yet, every now and then, when I was alone under the starry sky, I would hear a distant murmur, a whisper of old hymns, or a faint recitation of a diary entry. And I'd smile, knowing that the past was still there, gently reminding me of its presence. On my final morning at the colony, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon and painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, I took one last walk around the meeting house. The building now seemed less a haunted relic and more a cherished monument to lives lived long ago. I stepped inside one last time, sat in one of the old pews, and opened my notebook to record my final thoughts. I wrote of the surreal experience, of the echo of time that had enveloped me, and of the quiet redemption that comes from embracing both joy and sorrow as parts of one's own story. Driving away later that day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The temporal rift that had once blurred the lines between past and present had slowly mended, leaving behind a quiet reminder that our memories, no matter how painful, are an integral part of who we are. The Amana colonies had taught me that the past, with all its beauty and tragedy, need not be feared or forgotten. Instead, by acknowledging its presence, we can learn to move forward with a deeper understanding of ourselves. Now, as I continue my journey on the open roads of Iowa, I carry with me the lessons learned on that forgotten path. The diary remains safely tucked in my bag, a relic that bridges centuries, a testament to the enduring power of memory. Every time I pass by a historic landmark or see an old building bathed in the light of the setting sun, I pause and remember the faces and voices of the colonists, the desperate ritual in the meeting house, and the profound truth that time, in all its mysterious ways, leaves an indelible mark on our souls. My name is James Caldwell, and though my past is filled with regrets and broken dreams, I now know that healing comes from honoring every moment, both the lost and the remembered. The echoes of history will forever guide me, reminding me that even when the present seems isolated and the future uncertain, the lessons of the past can light the way to a brighter tomorrow. As the miles roll by beneath the wheels of my RV and the open skies stretch endlessly overhead, I find solace in the gentle hum of the engine and the quiet murmur of the wind. I sometimes catch a glimpse of a shadow that doesn't belong to the present, a fleeting figure from another time, but I no longer fear it. Instead, I offer a silent nod of gratitude, for it is in those moments that I remember the beauty of life's endless, intertwined tapestry. In the soft light of dawn, as I drive away from the Amana colonies, I know that I am not leaving the past behind. Rather, I am carrying it with me, a cherished companion on this journey of self-discovery and redemption. Every memory, every whispered voice from long ago serves as a reminder that we are all connected across time, bound by our shared stories, our triumphs, and our regrets. This is my story, a story of solitude, of temporal echoes, and of the healing power of understanding our history. And as I continue on this winding road, I remain forever grateful for the day I answered the call of time's forgotten road, and in doing so, rediscovered the timeless nature of hope and renewal. My name is Michael Harper, and I am 42 years old. This all happened one fateful autumn when my wife Susan, our rebellious teenage daughter Emily, and our sensitive young son Jacob set out on an RV camping trip to escape the relentless pace of city life. We thought we were headed for a much-needed break near the outskirts of Des Moines, Iowa, a secluded RV park nestled among dense woods with a dark, almost forgotten history. From the moment we pulled our old RV into the clearing, an inexplicable chill settled over us. The RV, a creaking veteran of many road trips, already had its quirks. The generator sputtered to life only half-heartedly, and the electrical system flickered intermittently. A minor inconvenience at first that would soon become ominous. I had always prided myself on being a practical, skeptical man, relying on logic and reason. But that day, something deep inside me stirred with unease. Our goal was simple: reconnect as a family amidst nature's quiet beauty, away from the noise and stress of urban life. Susan, ever intuitive and nurturing, had been looking forward to the fresh air and the chance to leave behind the constant barrage of city worries. Emily, in her typical fashion, craved adventure and mystery. She was determined to explore every inch of the woods, and little Jacob, with his wide, curious eyes, was both excited and frightened by the prospect of new sights and sounds. The first evening was unsettling in its subtleties. As dusk settled, I noticed that the usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness. In the silence, I could almost hear whispers, soft, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. Susan mentioned that the locals had once told stories of voices in the wind and of lost souls wandering these parts. I brushed it off as nothing more than folklore, but a part of me remained alert. While setting up a small area outside the RV, Emily wandered a short distance down a narrow trail. Moments later, she returned with a strange, tattered journal clutched in her hand. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and cryptic symbols were scrawled along the margins. According to the brief notes inside, the journal once belonged to a settler who had witnessed a horrific tragedy. A family whose children had perished in a mysterious incident, leaving behind restless spirits said to haunt these woods. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine as I flipped through the pages. Susan, too, seemed visibly disturbed, whispering that the journal might be a warning. That night, the RV's generator faltered again, plunging us into darkness for several long minutes. In the pitch-black silence, I thought I heard soft giggles, childlike, yet laced with sorrow. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the darkness, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed shadowy figures darting among the trees. They looked like children playing, yet their movements were oddly disjointed, as if they were not quite of this world. I dismissed the images as tricks of my tired mind, but Susan's worried glance told me she sensed something more. The next morning, I ventured into the nearby town to seek out supplies and perhaps some rational explanation for our eerie experiences. In a dimly lit corner of a small local diner, I met old Harold, a wiry man with deep-set eyes and a voice that seemed to echo with the weight of years. Over a cup of bitter coffee, he warned me in hushed tones about the area's dark past. "They say the spirits of those lost linger here, bound to the land by sorrow and injustice," he said. "Disturb them, and you might invite a darkness that won't let go." His words, though cloaked in local superstition, resonated with me, and I left the diner with more questions than answers. Returning to the RV, I found Susan anxiously rearranging our meager supplies and checking the locks on every window. Emily, notebook in hand, was scribbling fervently in her own journal, likely documenting every strange detail for her own amusement or perhaps for a future story. Meanwhile, Jacob sat quietly on the floor, his small face pale, his eyes fixed on a dark corner of the RV as though expecting something to emerge. As the day turned to evening, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed with an almost menacing rhythm. Susan and I set up makeshift defenses around the RV, candles placed at strategic points, a circle of salt by the door, and old photographs of the settler family mentioned in the journal, which we had painstakingly copied from the faded text. I had never been one for superstitions, but the mounting evidence of something unnatural made me willing to try anything. That night, the air was heavy with dread. The RV's interior was bathed in the flickering glow of candlelight, casting dancing shadows that seemed to twist into ghastly shapes. I sat by the window, my eyes straining to see outside. At first, I saw nothing but the dense black woods. Then, slowly, I noticed movement. A pair of small figures, barely discernible, moving between the trees. They appeared for a moment and then vanished as quickly as they had come. My heart pounded as I recalled old Harold's warning about the lingering spirits of lost children. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the uneasy calm. I rushed to the door to see what had happened. The RV's window had shattered, glass scattering across the floor. For a moment, I thought it was just a stray branch, but then I saw it. A small handprint smeared with dirt and what looked like old, dried blood. Jacob whimpered, clutching his mother's hand, and Emily's eyes widened in terror. Susan's voice trembled as she murmured, "They're here." Over the next few hours, the supernatural manifestations grew bolder. Unseen forces hurled objects across the cramped space. A framed photograph of our family flew off the wall and shattered on the floor. Every time I attempted to reassure my family, the sounds of soft, pained cries filled the night, as if unseen children were mourning their lost lives. The journal's cryptic descriptions of ritual and appeasement raced through my mind. Perhaps there was a way to confront this darkness head-on. Desperate and increasingly convinced that our lives were in grave danger, I decided that we must try to understand and contain the force that was haunting us. Susan, despite her gentle nature, steeled herself to research the rituals mentioned in the journal. She pored over its faded pages, deciphering symbols and cross-referencing local legends that described a vengeful spirit bound to a tragic past. Emily, ever the curious soul, volunteered to join her, determined to get to the heart of the mystery even as the events around us grew more violent. Meanwhile, I took it upon myself to secure our immediate safety, reinforcing the RV's perimeter and keeping a constant vigil. Late that night, as I sat awake in the cramped back room of the RV, I heard soft, mournful weeping coming from outside. It was so faint that I wondered if it were a trick of the wind or my imagination. But then, in the dead of night, I heard a clear, desperate cry. "Help me!" It was a voice that chilled my blood, a child's voice, filled with sorrow and terror. I knew then that this was no mere haunting. This was an active, malevolent presence determined to make its mark on our lives. The following day, the tension within our small group reached a breaking point. Emily, despite our repeated warnings, had left the safety of the RV during the morning, determined to document whatever she could of the supernatural events. Susan and I argued fiercely over whether to let her continue her reckless pursuit or to keep her sheltered from the dangers that lurked in the woods. In the heat of the moment, old resentments and unspoken fears bubbled to the surface. I, the reluctant leader, found my authority questioned as I struggled to balance my rational skepticism with the undeniable terror that now plagued us all. My inner turmoil peaked when I discovered that Jacob had vanished from his makeshift bed in the middle of the night. Panic surged through me as I searched the RV frantically. Susan's eyes filled with tears, and I could see the guilt and helplessness etched on her face. I stepped outside into the cold night, calling Jacob's name as I combed through the darkness. The woods seemed to swallow my cries, offering only the eerie echo of a child's laughter, a sound that was at once innocent and chilling. After what felt like an eternity, I found him huddled near a large oak tree, his face streaked with tears, staring intently at a figure in the distance that I couldn't quite make out. When I reached him, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving only a lingering sense of malevolence. By now, It was clear that the supernatural force haunting us was not content with simple manifestations. The spirit, or perhaps the collective sorrow of the lost souls, had grown dangerously violent. In the dead of that night, as a storm raged outside, our RV was besieged. Windows shattered with a force that suggested deliberate malice, and the wind carried with it the cries of the ghostly children, now desperate and wrathful. Amid the chaos, a sudden, violent impact sent our RV careening, nearly overturning it on the uneven ground. I clutched Susan tightly as the realization dawned on me. This malevolent presence was determined to claim us as its victims. Desperation drove us to attempt one last stand. Susan, Emily, and I gathered what courage we could muster and prepared to confront the force directly. We set up a protective circle around the RV using salt and the old photographs and symbols from the journal as our talismans. I recall Susan's trembling voice as she recited passages from the journal, her words barely audible above the howling wind. The air crackled with energy as if the boundaries between our world and something darker were thinning. In that fraught moment, the presence manifested with terrifying clarity. The ghostly children, whose earlier appearances had been fleeting and sorrowful, now emerged in full spectral form. Their faces were twisted in anguish, their eyes pleading and accusatory. Amid their ranks, a larger, more sinister figure took shape, a dark, contorted silhouette that radiated hatred and sorrow in equal measure. I recognized it from the journal as the vengeful spirit of a mother who had lost her children in a tragic accident, cursed to roam these woods in perpetual mourning. But there was something else about this apparition, a malevolence that suggested the spirit had been twisted by time and anger into something far more dangerous. As the confrontation escalated, Emily, in her determination to capture evidence, had slipped away once again into the depths of the forest. I shouted for her to return, my voice breaking with fear, but the chorus of spectral voices drowned out my pleas. Susan's eyes were locked on the advancing apparitions as she continued her incantations, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. The spirit's outstretched arms reached for us, and in a burst of supernatural force a gust of wind knocked me to the ground. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and vulnerable, while the spirit's presence loomed over us like a dark omen of doom. Then, in the midst of the pandemonium, a horrible accident occurred that would forever mark this night. As I struggled to my feet, a local man, a grizzled figure who had offered us cryptic warnings earlier, appeared at the edge of our circle. He tried to intervene, speaking urgently in a language I couldn't understand fully, his eyes wild with desperation. Before we could react, a violent surge of energy slammed him to the ground. His body convulsed, and he let out a final, anguished cry before falling silent. His sudden, fatal collapse was a stark reminder that this evil was not merely a spectral nuisance. It was deadly, indiscriminate, and intent on erasing any who dared to confront it. The impact of that loss shattered any lingering illusions that we could simply placate the supernatural by reciting old rites or fortifying our physical defenses. Susan, normally the emotional bedrock of our family, crumbled in grief and fear, while I felt an overwhelming surge of responsibility and guilt. I was determined above all to protect my children, even if it meant facing a darkness I had long dismissed as myth. I gathered Jacob in my arms and staggered back to the RV, my mind racing with desperate plans to escape the relentless onslaught. At the break of dawn, when the storm had finally subsided and an eerie calm replaced the chaos, I ventured into the woods to search for Emily. The forest was shrouded in a heavy mist, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the early morning. I followed faint traces of footprints and distant, echoing laughter until I stumbled upon her near a clearing marked by ancient oak trees. She stood transfixed, her eyes fixed on a stone altar covered in strange symbols, the same markings that had haunted the pages of the journal. I rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace as the oppressive weight of the supernatural presence lifted, if only momentarily. Back at the RV, we made a hurried decision. We would leave this cursed place as soon as possible. Packing our scant belongings and mustering every last bit of strength, we started the RV's engine, which roared uncertainly as if protesting the abrupt change in our destiny. As we drove away, the woods seemed to close in behind us, the spectral figures receding into the mist with mournful wails echoing in the distance. In the days that followed, we sought help from local authorities and paranormal researchers, but our experiences were met with skepticism and bureaucratic indifference. The incident at the RV park was brushed aside as a series of unfortunate events, a tragic convergence of bad luck, old equipment, and overactive imaginations. Yet, I knew in my heart that what we had faced was real. The evil spirit, the vengeful ghosts, and the mysterious force that had claimed a local life were not confined to a single night. They lingered in the shadows of the Iowa backwoods, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to wander too close. Now, even as I write these words, I can still feel the chill of that autumn night creeping over me. My family and I have tried to resume our normal lives, but the memories are indelible. Susan still wakes up in cold sweats, muttering prayers in the dead of night, and Jacob clings to me whenever the wind picks up, his eyes wide with terror at the slightest creak in the floorboards. Emily, ever the storyteller, is haunted by visions she captures in her sketches, phantom faces and twisted forms that she insists are not mere dreams. I have come to accept that the evil we encountered in those woods is not something that can be banished by simple rituals or logical reasoning. It is an ancient force, bound to the land by sorrow and injustice, that exists beyond the realm of our understanding. And while we manage to escape with our lives, the scars, both physical and spiritual, remain as a constant reminder that some tragedies are eternal, and some spirits, no matter how tormented, are never truly at rest. I often drive along the back roads near Des Moines, and sometimes, in the quiet moments just before dawn, I can still hear those faint, ghostly giggles carried on the wind. I know that the woods are not empty. They are filled with memories and lost souls, with warnings that time and again remind us that nature and the supernatural are intertwined in ways we can scarcely comprehend. For me, every journey now is a careful dance between rationality and the acknowledgement that some mysteries, like the tragic legacy of that cursed RV park, will forever elude explanation. And so, with every mile I drive, I carry with me the memory of that haunting night, a permanent testament to the fact that sometimes, to survive, you must confront the darkness head-on, even when it comes in the form of vengeful spirits and ghostly children, and even when it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about the world. This is my story, a story of isolation, terror, and the relentless struggle to protect those you love against forces that are as old as the land itself. And though I try not to dwell on it, the experience has changed me irrevocably. I have learned that survival is not just about escaping danger, but about understanding that sometimes the most profound battles are fought within the depths of our own souls, when confronted with the echoes of a past that refuses to be forgotten. My name is Ethan Walker, and I am 35 years old. This happened one fog-laden autumn when I decided to leave behind a life riddled with regret and take a solitary RV camping trip near Spirit Lake, Iowa. I hoped that the open road and reflective waters might grant me the clarity I'd been desperately searching for, a chance to confront the ghosts of my past and perhaps begin to forgive myself. I'd bought this aging RV a couple of years ago, more out of a sense of wanderlust than any real belief in the magic of the journey. Even then, I knew it was a relic, Its engine coughed on cold mornings, its electronics flickered like candlelight in a draft, and its interior held the memories of many long, lonely nights. As I drove along the back roads leading to Spirit Lake, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the journey would be about far more than physical miles. The RV park was remote, nestled on a stretch of land where the tall pines and whispering aspens stood like silent sentinels guarding ancient secrets. Spirit Lake itself was a vast, mirror-like expanse, its waters perfectly still under the heavy gray sky. Local lore hinted at reflections that revealed more than just one's face, and I, with all my internal burdens, found that notion both repellent and irresistible. During my first night, as the wind began to howl outside and the rain drummed softly on the roof, I sat by the dim light of a sputtering lamp. I was alone, truly alone. The radio, usually a companion on these lonely nights, started acting up. I tuned it to a familiar station, but instead of the usual static and occasional talk show banter, I caught fragments of voices. Snatches of my own thoughts whispered back at me, layered over eerie, distorted music. It was as if the machine were echoing the regrets I'd long tried to bury. I shook my head, blaming faulty wiring and my own overactive imagination. The next morning, I set out in the damp light of early dawn. I had planned to drive a little further along the lake's edge, hoping that the solitude would help me piece together my scattered thoughts. But as I navigated a particularly winding stretch of road, I caught sight of something in my rearview mirror. A fleeting image of a man who looked disturbingly like me. I jerked my eyes back to the road, heart pounding. But there was nothing there except the endless ribbon of asphalt fading into the mist. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps the consequence of too many sleepless nights. Yet a gnawing sensation of dread began to settle in my gut. That afternoon, I pulled into a small gas station off a deserted corner of the highway. The place was a relic, too, with peeling paint and a single flickering neon sign. The attendant, an old mechanic with tired eyes and a gravelly voice, eyed me suspiciously as I filled up. "Heard some folks talk about seeing their own shadows on these roads," he muttered, his tone a mix of amusement and caution. "Some say it's the work of the shadow traveler, a ghostly double for those who carry heavy burdens." I laughed nervously, but his words lingered long after I drove away. That evening, the atmosphere around the RV grew palpably heavy. While I prepared a meager dinner on a portable stove, I noticed that the reflection in the RV's side mirror wasn't quite right. In the glass, I saw my own silhouette, but for a brief moment, a second figure appeared beside me, mirroring every movement. I spun around, half expecting to see another person crouched there, but the space was empty. My pulse raced, and a chill crept along my spine. Was it just my imagination, or was something truly amiss? Sleep was a fickle friend that night. I tossed and turned, plagued by recurring dreams of a man, my doppelganger, standing on the edge of a darkened lake, his eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't bear. The dreams bled into reality. As I lay in bed, I could swear I heard the RV's doors creak open, and a low, mocking whisper of my own voice echoed in the shadows. Unable to shake these unsettling experiences, I decided to visit a small local library the following day. I hoped that digging into the region's history might offer some rational explanation for the strange occurrences. The library was a modest building, its shelves filled with dusty volumes and old newspapers. In one of the local history sections, I found clippings about Spirit Lake and legends of travelers who claimed to see their mirror selves in its reflective waters. One article detailed the tale of a man, tormented by guilt over a tragic loss, who encountered a spectral double that drove him to madness. The description was chillingly similar to what I was experiencing. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I began to piece together a theory. My doppelganger wasn't just a trick of the mind, but a supernatural manifestation, a physical embodiment of all my unresolved guilt and pain. The idea both terrified and intrigued me. I'd spent years running from the mistakes of my past, believing that time might heal the wounds. But here, on these desolate roads and beside the reflective waters of Spirit Lake, the ghosts of my regrets had taken on a life of their own. As dusk approached on my third night at the RV park, I resolved to confront this haunting presence. I gathered what little supplies I had, a battered journal, a few candles, and an old photograph of myself from happier times, and decided to perform a makeshift ritual. It wasn't derived from any formal tradition, but rather a desperate attempt to exorcise the lingering shadows within me. I set up a small circle outside the RV, placing the candles in a rough formation, and opened my journal to write down my deepest regrets, failures in relationships, lost opportunities, and the haunting memory of a mistake that had cost me dearly. The night was unnervingly still as I began to speak aloud, my voice trembling as I recounted my sins and begged for forgiveness, from others, and most of all, from myself. As I finished, the candle's flames flickered violently, and for a split second I saw a shape moving at the edge of the circle, a figure that bore my own features, but with eyes that burned with an otherworldly intensity. In that moment, I realized that the doppelganger was not merely a passive observer. It was active, malicious even, as if fueled by my inner torment. I watched, paralyzed with a mix of horror and resolve, as the figure stepped closer, its movements mirroring mine in a twisted, mocking dance. The air thickened, and I could feel the weight of all the pain I'd been carrying, pressing down on me like an invisible shroud. The struggle that ensued was as much within as it was without. I fought not just to repel this apparition, but to confront the very essence of my guilt. Every whispered confession, every tear that fell in that cold night seemed to chip away at the doppelganger's form. Yet, for every moment of catharsis, it fought back, its eyes blazing with the fury of unresolved anguish. At one point, as the circle of candles trembled under a sudden gust of wind, the figure lunged forward, causing the flames to dance erratically. In that chaotic light, I could see flashes of memories I'd long tried to forget. The faces of those I'd lost, the opportunities squandered, the self-inflicted wounds that had festered over the years. The confrontation climaxed near the water's edge, where the reflective surface of Spirit Lake lay like a sheet of black glass under the moon. Drawn by a force I could neither understand nor resist, I found myself standing at the shoreline. The doppelganger emerged from the mist, fully formed, a perfect yet horrifying mirror image of myself. Its eyes, dark and unyielding, stared into mine with a mixture of accusation and sorrow. In the silence that followed, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. Here, in the cold embrace of the lake's edge, I was forced to confront every hidden corner of my soul. The figure spoke without words, its presence a silent indictment of every regret and every failure. With trembling resolve, I spoke aloud, letting every hidden sorrow pour forth. The guilt of broken promises, the remorse for decisions that had cost me dearly, the deep-seated self-loathing that had haunted my every step. I offered forgiveness to myself, a plea for redemption that had been years in the making. For a long, agonizing moment, the two of us stood there, my true self and the spectral embodiment of my guilt, locked in a silent battle of wills. The lake's surface rippled as if reacting to the surge of emotion, and slowly, the doppelganger's form began to waver. Its features softened, the intensity in its eyes dimmed, and as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, it dissipated into the mist. The malevolent presence that had haunted my every step was gone, replaced by a profound emptiness and a fragile sense of relief. I returned to the RV with a heaviness in my heart, a mixture of sorrow for the pain I had endured and gratitude for the catharsis that had just occurred. The supernatural disturbances that had plagued my journey for days seemed to recede, leaving behind an eerie calm. Yet, I knew that the journey wasn't truly over. The scars of that night were etched into my soul, a constant reminder that the battle with one's inner demons is never fully won. Over the following days, I made slow progress toward repairing both the physical state of my RV and the shattered fragments of my spirit. I spent long hours sitting by the lake, watching the water reflect not only the sky above, but also the countless memories of my past. Each ripple seemed to carry away a piece of my former pain, though I understood that some of it would remain forever, a reminder of the arduous path toward self-forgiveness. I eventually repaired the RV's failing systems, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the vehicle had served as a kind of crucible for my soul. The mechanical failures, the inexplicable radio broadcasts, and the fleeting glimpses of my own shadow had all converged to force me into an intimate confrontation with my own guilt. I continued my journey along the winding back roads, and with every mile, I felt a tentative renewal, a cautious hope that perhaps I was finally on a path to healing. Even now, as I drive along the quiet roads near Spirit Lake, I sometimes catch a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror, a shadow that mimics my actions with uncanny precision. In those fleeting moments, a chill runs down my spine, not from fear of the supernatural, but as a reminder of the inner battles I've fought and the scars that remain. I no longer see these reflections as harbingers of doom, but rather as echoes of the man I once was, the man who was so weighed down by regret that he could no longer see the possibility of redemption. My journey taught me that sometimes the most terrifying specters are not those that lurk in the dark woods or on the surface of a haunted lake, but the ones that reside deep within our own hearts. I learned that confronting those inner demons requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the most painful truths of our existence. And though the supernatural events along Spirit Lake were terrifying and inexplicable, they forced me to embark on a journey of self-discovery that I might never have taken otherwise. Now, I continue to travel these lonely roads, not in search of another haunted night or a mystical encounter, but to remind myself that every mile driven is a step toward healing. The reflective waters of Spirit Lake will always hold a piece of my past, a mirror to the shadows that once tormented me. And as I drive on, I carry with me the hard-won lesson that true redemption is found not in escaping our memories, but in embracing them, and ultimately in forgiving ourselves. This is my story, a journey through darkness and light, through the haunted reflections of a troubled soul, and finally toward the dawn of self-acceptance. Each mile I travel serves as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, and a reminder that even the most formidable shadows can be dispelled by the light of truth and forgiveness. My name is Jasmine Reed, and I am 29 years old. This happened one autumn when I decided to follow a trail of whispers and unsolved disappearances deep in the backwoods of Iowa. I was no stranger to chasing down mysteries. I'm an investigative journalist by trade, but nothing had prepared me for the secrets of Witch's Hollow. I'd rented a dated RV for the assignment, its faded exterior and creaking frame a stark reminder that modern technology often failed when confronted with the old and inexplicable. The vehicle's engine grumbled in protest as I navigated winding back roads that cut through dense stands of oak and pine. With every mile, the isolation grew thicker, as if the land itself were pushing me away from the safety of civilization. Witch's Hollow was a name spoken of in hushed tones among the locals, a remote clearing wrapped in folklore and tragedy. Rumors claimed that a vengeful witch, once a respected healer betrayed by those she loved, cursed these woods, exacting retribution on unwary travelers. As I drove, a sense of foreboding crept into my heart. I wasn't just chasing a story. I was stepping into a realm where the past and the present merged into something dark and inescapable. The RV campsite I selected sat on the fringes of Witch's Hollow, positioned precariously between a narrow dirt road and a thicket of ancient trees. The moment I parked, I noticed subtle signs that something wasn't right. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and herbs, smells that seemed both familiar and unnervingly out of place in the middle of nowhere. I set up my equipment as best as I could, though my recording devices and cameras, already temperamental, began malfunctioning at the slightest provocation. Every time I tried to capture footage of the surrounding woods, the screens would flicker and distort, as if an unseen force were meddling with the electronics. That first night, as the wind whispered through the trees, I sat outside the RV with my laptop open, determined to log every detail of my experience. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant creak, a sound I initially dismissed as the natural settling of old wood. But then came a soft, almost imperceptible chanting, like a murmur carried on the breeze. I strained my ears, convinced it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks, yet the words, though unintelligible, resonated with an eerie cadence that sent shivers down my spine. The next morning, I decided to explore the area on foot. Grabbing my notepad and a small digital recorder, I trekked into the forest. The canopy overhead was dense, filtering the pale light into a murky twilight even at noon. It wasn't long before I came upon something that made my heart pound. A series of cryptic symbols carved into the bark of an old oak. The markings were deliberate, reminiscent of ancient rituals and warning signs. Nearby, a scattering of personal belongings. A child's small toy, a tarnished locket, lay abandoned on the forest floor. It was as if someone, or something, had hurriedly left them behind in a moment of panic. As I continued my investigation, I began to notice fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision. A cloaked figure, always distant and unapproachable, seemed to drift between the trees. Every time I turned to look directly, the figure would vanish, leaving me questioning whether I was being watched or if my imagination was running wild. The further I ventured, the more the forest revealed its secrets. Hushed voices that echoed without source, the sudden crack of twigs in complete silence, and the unmistakable sensation of eyes following my every step. That evening, I returned to the RV feeling both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. I attempted to compile my findings, but my equipment continued to misbehave, recorders cutting out unexpectedly and cameras capturing only static when pointed toward the darkest corners of the woods. I began receiving cryptic messages from locals via a prepaid cell phone I had purchased for emergencies. One call, from a gruff, weathered voice, warned, "Don't push too deep into Witch's Hollow. The witch's curse isn't just a story, it's real, and it hungers." The message left me with more questions than answers, but it confirmed that the legends I was investigating were not mere folklore. Determined to get to the heart of the mystery, I sought out any surviving records of the curse. A visit to a derelict farmhouse on the outskirts of a nearby town introduced me to Mr. Harlan, an old caretaker who had once looked after the property. In a voice thick with years of sorrow, he recounted the tale of a healer, a kind woman who had cared for the sick and the poor until betrayal shattered her trust. Her heart, broken by those she had once nurtured, had turned to bitter vengeance. In a fit of rage and despair, she invoked a curse upon the land, declaring that no one who trespassed would leave unchanged, and that her spirit would forever haunt these woods. Mr. Harlan's eyes, brimming with unspoken pain, warned me. Some things should remain buried, Miss Reed. Back at the campsite, night fell with an oppressive weight. I prepared for what I knew was coming. I recalled the scattered items I had found and the legends of a ritual that might weaken the curse's hold. Gathering a small collection of personal mementos, an old photograph of my late grandmother, a broken mirror shard I'd carried for luck, and a few dried herbs found near the carvings, I set up a makeshift altar outside the RV. The spot, a small clearing bathed in the light of a rising full moon, felt like a natural stage for the showdown that was to come. I arranged the items with trembling hands, my pulse thundering as I recited lines from an old incantation I had pieced together from various sources. The night was silent, almost unnaturally so when I began. My voice, steady at first, wavered as the wind picked up, swirling around the altar. I could sense something stirring, a presence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken on a form, a cloaked apparition with eyes that glinted with malice. The witch had made herself known. In that charged moment, the forest exploded into chaos. Objects began to fly across the clearing, stones, twigs, even the delicate glass of my recorder's casing shattered against the ground. The air pulsed with energy, and the temperature dropped abruptly, as if I had stepped into the very maw of winter. I realized that the witch's minions, twisted echoes of her malice, had been awakened, and they now sought to silence my intrusion. Desperation lent me strength as I clutched the small vial of herbs and the shard of mirror. I shouted for the spirit to show itself, to explain the pain and betrayal that had birthed this curse. In response, the forest fell eerily silent, and then a low, anguished moan echoed from the depths of Witch's Hollow. The sound was not entirely human. It was the cry of a soul tormented beyond measure. I felt my resolve waver as images flashed before my eyes, faces twisted in grief, voices of lost souls pleading for release. I pressed on, determined to document everything, despite the terror that threatened to consume me. With shaky hands, I recorded the moment, capturing the spectral figure as it slowly coalesced into a more defined shape. The witch appeared before me in a swirl of dark mist and sorrowful eyes. Her face, partially hidden by a tattered hood, bore the anguish of centuries, and her outstretched hand seemed to beckon me closer with an irresistible pull. In that instant, I understood that she was not merely a malevolent force. She was a broken spirit, consumed by the betrayal of those she once trusted. The confrontation escalated as she advanced. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the trees around me bent as if in submission to an ancient power. I attempted to recite the final lines of the incantation, hoping to break the cycle of vengeance, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of wind and despair. The witch's eyes locked onto mine, and in that gaze, I saw every bit of the betrayal and sorrow that had fueled her curse. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze as we stood there, a reporter facing a force of nature, a seeker of truth confronting the embodiment of ancient retribution. In the ensuing moments, a battle of wills unfolded. The witch's spectral form lunged toward me, and I dodged just in time, the force of her anger sending me sprawling across the cold, damp earth. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding as I clutched the relics I had gathered. My mind raced with the conflicting desires to capture undeniable evidence and to survive the onslaught. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet I knew that to truly understand the curse, I had to face it head-on. In a final act of defiance, I raised the mirror shard toward the apparition. The shard, though small and broken, reflected the full moon's light with a brilliance that cut through the darkness. For a heartbeat the witch recoiled, as if wounded by the reflection of her own sorrow. I seized that moment, reciting the incantation with all the conviction I could muster. My voice, though raw with fear, rang out across the clearing, a desperate plea for redemption for both her and myself. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The wind roared, and the forest itself seemed to tremble as the witch's form wavered. Her eyes, filled with a mix of rage and profound sorrow, flickered uncertainly. I felt a strange warmth spread through me, a sign that the ritual was working, even as the curse clung desperately to its hold. With one final anguished cry, the witch's form began to dissolve, scattering into motes of shadow that drifted away on the night wind. The supernatural assault gradually subsided, leaving behind a silence that was both eerie and fragile. In the aftermath, I sat alone in the clearing, the moon casting long, spectral shadows over the forest floor. My body ached from the confrontation, and my hands trembled as I clutched the remnants of my ritual. I had managed to weaken the curse, or at least drive the witch back into the recesses of Witch's Hollow, but I knew that her malice still lingered in the dark corners of those woods. The evidence I had recorded, fragmented images, broken equipment, and the indelible imprint of that sorrowful gaze, would be enough to change everything. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had paid a heavy price for the truth. The days that followed were a blur of cautious repairs and furtive glances over my shoulder. I attempted to reassemble my equipment, salvaging what I could from the wreckage of that night. Though my cameras and recorders were unreliable, the raw footage and notes I had managed to salvage provided undeniable proof of the curse's existence. I contacted a few trusted colleagues, sharing my findings with the hope that the world would finally acknowledge the legends that had haunted Witch's Hollow for generations. But even as I prepared to leave the campsite, I found that the experience had irrevocably changed me. The isolation and terror had carved deep scars in my psyche, and I often caught myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the witch's spectral form lurking behind every tree. The local residents, too, seemed different after my encounter, more wary, more resigned to the idea that some ancient curses could never be fully vanquished. On my final night at the site, I took one last walk through the woods. The forest was quieter now, the earlier cacophony of supernatural phenomena replaced by a haunting stillness. I paused at the edge of a small clearing known by locals as the Altar of Shadows, a natural formation where the ground was marked by strange weathered symbols. As I stood there, I felt a deep connection to the past, to the healer whose sorrow had given birth to this curse. I couldn't help but wonder if, in some twisted way, her pain was a warning, a reminder that truth and retribution were often two sides of the same coin. With a heavy heart and a mind swirling with unanswered questions, I loaded my salvaged equipment back into the RV. The journey out of Witch's Hollow was slow and somber. Every mile I drove away felt like a retreat from the abyss, yet I knew that the curse had not been truly vanquished. Its presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of my vision, a reminder that some forces in the world are beyond human control. As I finally merged onto a well-traveled highway, the bright lights of civilization beckoned, promising safety and normalcy. But I could still hear the distant murmur of chanting, the rustle of leaves, and the faint scent of burning sage that would forever remind me of the night I confronted an ancient curse. I knew that my story, the evidence, the terror, and the bitter truth of Witch's Hollow would change the way people looked at old legends. Yet, as I continued on my journey, a part of me remained forever entwined with those haunted woods, a silent witness to the enduring power of the past. I have come to understand that the quest for truth is a perilous path, often leading us into realms where the line between myth and reality blurs into nothingness. My time in Witch's Hollow taught me that some curses, born of deep betrayal and endless sorrow, can never be entirely broken. They can only be held at bay, like a storm that eventually recedes, leaving behind both relief and lingering dread. Now, as I look back on that harrowing experience, I am filled with a mix of triumph and melancholy. I succeeded in capturing undeniable evidence of the supernatural, a story that will not only advance my career, but also serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of ancient, unfathomable forces. And yet, every so often, I pause in the quiet of the night and wonder if the curse will one day resurface, calling me back to the dark heart of Witch's Hollow. This is my story, a journey into the depths of ancient folklore and the relentless pursuit of truth amidst isolation and terror. I continue my work as an investigative journalist, forever changed by the encounter, and with a newfound respect for the mysteries that lie hidden in the shadows of our modern world. Even now, I carry with me the heavy knowledge that some secrets are guarded by forces beyond our control, and that the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we ever dare to imagine. My name is Leo Daniels, and I am 47 years old. This all happened one late summer near Clear Lake, Iowa, a time when I was desperate to escape the painful echoes of my past and search for meaning in the unexplainable. I was once a history professor dedicated to the study of the past, but after a personal tragedy shattered my academic career and left me reclusive and burdened by grief, I found myself adrift in a world that no longer made sense. In a final attempt to reconcile my sorrow and my scholarly curiosity, I rented an RV and headed for an isolated park on the outskirts of Clear Lake, a place whispered about in local lore as a nexus of time anomalies. The RV itself was a mixture of modern convenience and stubborn age. Though equipped with what should have been state-of-the-art recording devices and a digital camera, it seemed that technology here had a mind of its own. As I drove along narrow, winding back roads flanked by towering pines and ancient oaks, the atmosphere felt charged, as if the very air were pregnant with secrets. I had chosen this spot not only to find solitude but also to investigate reports that clocks here inexplicably glitched, showing dates and times that belonged to eras long past, or even the distant future. After several hours on the road, I finally pulled into a secluded RV park that sat on a sliver of land near Clear Lake. The park was almost entirely silent, with only a few scattered units and the hum of nature as my company. I set up camp with a sense of quiet determination, unpacking my meticulously prepared notebooks, my digital recorder, and my camera. I had also brought along my personal laptop, hoping to document every anomaly in detail. That very first evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blushed with twilight, I began to notice the first signs that something was off. I was sitting outside the RV, sipping lukewarm coffee, when my digital clock, mounted inconspicuously above the console, flickered. For a moment, it displayed a date I did not recognize, July 4th, 1865. I rubbed my eyes, dismissing it as a fleeting glitch, yet the image burned into my memory. Later that night, as I attempted to upload my notes to my laptop, the screen glitched and a series of unfamiliar, archaic numbers and symbols danced across it before settling back to the present date. I couldn't shake the feeling that time here was not as linear as it should be. The next morning, determined to collect tangible evidence of these anomalies, I ventured out on foot. I walked along a narrow, leaf-strewn path that cut through the thick woods surrounding the RV park. The dappled sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy overhead, leaving everything bathed in a surreal half-light. About a mile from the park, I stumbled upon something extraordinary, an antique pocket watch lying on the forest floor. Its silver casing was intricately engraved with delicate filigree, and it seemed to pulse with a subtle, inexplicable energy. I picked it up gingerly. On its face, the hands were frozen at exactly 3:15, an image that immediately struck me as significant. I tucked the watch into my jacket pocket, unsure whether it was a relic left behind by time or by someone who had once sought to warn future generations. Throughout that day, I began noticing more peculiarities. While driving slowly along a narrow forest road in the late afternoon, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. A procession of figures dressed in period clothing, as if straight out of the 19th century. They marched silently across the road, their faces obscured by the brim of wide hats and somber expressions, before vanishing into the thickening fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. I slammed on the brakes and peered through the windshield, heart pounding in my ears, but the road lay empty. The sight left me shaken, though I struggled to rationalize it as a trick of the light or the product of an overactive imagination fueled by my own inner demons. Returning to the RV, I attempted to analyze the recordings from my camera and digital recorder. Instead of the crisp, modern images I was expecting, I found brief, inexplicable moments of static intercut with blurry scenes of horse-drawn carriages and gaslit streets. In one recording, I even caught what seemed to be a fragment of conversation in an archaic dialect, a language I could not place, spoken in hushed, urgent tones. I replayed the clip repeatedly, each time growing more convinced that I was witnessing something extraordinary. The very boundaries of time, long believed to be immutable, were fraying right before my eyes. The isolation of the RV park, far from offering the comforting solitude I had craved, began to press in on me. There was no cell phone reception here, and the nearest town was miles away, its inhabitants as mysterious and reticent as the legends that surrounded this place. I started to feel the weight of being marooned on the edge of time, with nothing but my own thoughts and the eerie anomalies to keep me company. That night, the disturbances escalated. I awoke to the sound of a persistent knocking, not on the door, but as if coming from within the very walls of the RV. I lay frozen, straining to identify the source. The knocking was soft but insistent, echoing through the small space in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. After a long, agonizing minute, the sound ceased abruptly. Trembling, I forced myself to get up and check every window and door, but nothing appeared amiss. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. Over the next couple of days, the temporal anomalies grew more pronounced. My recording devices, which had already shown erratic behavior, began to capture fleeting glimpses of events from bygone eras. At one point, while reviewing footage on my laptop, I saw a shadowy figure, dressed in the clothes of a 19th century laborer, appearing briefly in the background of a modern scene. In another instance, the digital clock in the RV inexplicably reset itself to display times and dates that were impossible, moments from the future that I could not comprehend. One particularly disconcerting afternoon, as I sat outside the RV jotting down notes in my journal, a sudden gust of wind stirred the leaves around me. In the midst of the rustling, I distinctly heard the sound of a horse's hooves clattering on cobblestones, a sound that did not belong in the quiet rural woods of modern Iowa. I stood up, heart racing, and scanned the horizon. For just a few seconds, the landscape seemed to shimmer, as if overlaid with a ghostly tableau. A bustling street scene from another time, complete with horse-drawn carriages and people in old-fashioned attire, unfolding before my very eyes. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision vanished, leaving me with nothing but the echo of distant, indistinct voices. I felt an irresistible pull toward the antique pocket watch I had found earlier. It was as if the object held the key to understanding the anomalies. a tangible link to the lost time I was beginning to witness. I spent hours researching its origins in the few local records I managed to salvage from the RV park's small library. I learned that similar watches had been passed down through generations, sometimes believed to be imbued with the power to capture moments frozen in time. The hands of the watch remained fixed at 3:15, a time that now haunted my every waking moment. It seemed to whisper of a moment when the past and the present collided, a moment that held the potential to unravel or restore the flow of time itself. That evening, as a violent storm began to roll in, the boundaries between eras shattered entirely. I had been reviewing my notes in the dim light of the RV when the winds outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The digital clock on the dashboard suddenly began to flicker wildly, displaying not only dates from the past but also fragments of images. A girl in a tattered dress, a soldier saluting in a parade, a stern-faced man in a top hat. It was as if time had become a jumbled collage of memories and possibilities. Unable to contain my mounting terror and fascination, I decided to venture outside with my recording equipment and the pocket watch clutched tightly in my hand. I needed to confront whatever force was at work. I trudged through the driving rain toward a small clearing near the edge of the RV park, where the trees opened up to reveal an expansive view of Clear Lake. The water, dark and mirror-like, reflected a sky torn between storm and starlight. Here, at the water's edge, I felt the pulse of time in every gust of wind and every ripple on the surface. And as I set up my tripod and began recording, my hands shaking as I positioned the antique pocket watch on a flat rock beside me. I whispered a tentative greeting to the night, a quiet plea for understanding, though my voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. As I stared into the inky water, a sudden surge of images flooded my mind. Visions of a world long past and moments yet to come. I saw flickers of a lively town square from the 1800s, complete with gaslit lamps and the murmurs of everyday life. Then, abruptly, I saw a figure that made my heart seize, a woman, strikingly familiar, with kind eyes and an expression of profound sorrow. In that fleeting moment, I recognized her as the woman I had loved and lost years ago, a presence that had haunted my dreams since her passing. Tears blurred my vision as I struggled to reconcile the spectral image with my own painful memories. Was it possible that my grief had summoned her back through some cosmic quirk of time? Or was this just another manifestation of the anomalies that plagued this place? The line between memory and reality had become irrevocably blurred, and I felt both blessed and cursed to witness such raw, unfiltered emotion. In the midst of my inner turmoil, the atmosphere around me shifted violently. The wind howled louder, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate with an ancient, unyielding energy. I felt compelled to act, to perform a gesture that might re-anchor the flow of time and, perhaps, offer a measure of catharsis for both myself and the restless spirits that appeared to haunt these woods. Recalling a ritual described in a dusty old manuscript I had found among the park's records, I resolved to bury the pocket watch at a specific landmark, a stone marker noted as significant in the local lore. I sprinted back to the RV, barely registering the barrage of images and sounds that seemed to coalesce around me. The storm reached a fever pitch as I drove the unreliable RV to a secluded spot on the outskirts of the park. There, hidden beneath a gnarled oak that had clearly witnessed centuries pass, lay a weathered stone marker inscribed with symbols I recognized from my research. With trembling hands, I dug a shallow hole beside the marker and, after a long moment of hesitation, placed the antique pocket watch inside. I pressed the soil over it carefully, as if I were laying a heavy burden to rest. As I stood there, drenched and shivering in the torrential rain, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The chaotic whispers and flickering visions receded, replaced by an almost palpable calm. The digital clock in my RV, which had been a source of relentless anxiety, settled into a steady rhythm once more. I couldn't be sure if the act of burying the watch had truly mended the tear in time, or if I had merely placated the forces that lurked in this strange nexus. Yet, for the first time in days, I allowed myself a tentative hope that order might be restored. In the hours that followed, the storm subsided, and the night gave way to a fragile dawn. I returned to the RV and spent a long, sleepless morning reviewing the footage and recordings. The evidence was inconclusive in many respects: fragmented images, garbled audio, and inexplicable glitches that defied explanation. But there was one thing I knew for certain: the boundaries between past and present, between memory and reality, had been irreversibly blurred in those moments by the lake. I had seen history unfold before my eyes, not as a static narrative in dusty textbooks, but as a living, breathing force that had touched my soul in ways I could scarcely comprehend. In the days that followed, I gradually prepared to leave the RV park. I salvaged what data I could, making sure to back up every file and annotate every anomaly with careful notes. The experience had been both a scholarly revelation and a deeply personal journey, a confrontation with the passage of time, with the ghosts of history, and with my own inescapable grief. As I packed my belongings, I couldn't help but glance at the digital clock on the dashboard one last time. For an instant it flickered, and I saw a date that was unmistakably from a century past. I shuddered, half expecting the vision to reappear, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Driving away from Clear Lake that morning, I felt an odd mixture of relief and melancholy. I had come here to document and understand temporal anomalies, but in the process I had also confronted the lingering pain of my personal history. I now carried with me not only the evidence of an inexplicable phenomenon, but also the realization that time, like memory, is a fragile construct, subject to sudden shifts and unpredictable intrusions. The experience had left an indelible mark on my soul, one that I knew would shape my understanding of history and of myself for years to come. Even as I rejoined the hum of modern life, I could still feel the lingering pull of those ancient forces. Every so often, a glimmer in a window or a stray comment would remind me of the fragile veil between eras, and I would pause, heart pounding, as I wondered if the past was truly gone or merely waiting for the right moment to reassert itself. The act of burying that antique pocket watch had, for a time, restored order to the world around me, but I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that the fabric of time was still, in some small way, unstitched, a secret left open, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it. Now, as I write these words in the relative safety of my small apartment, far removed from the eerie stillness of Clear Lake's backwoods, I remain both haunted and inspired. The journey taught me that history is not confined to the pages of books or the silent ruins of once great civilizations. It lives within us, in our memories, in our regrets, and in the inexplicable coincidences that sometimes defy all logic. I have come to accept that my own grief, once a source of unbearable pain, is now an integral part of who I am, a reminder that the past, no matter how sorrowful, can also illuminate the path forward. My time at the RV park near Clear Lake will forever be etched in my memory as a surreal intersection of science and the supernatural. A moment when I glimpsed the ebb and flow of time, when history reached out to touch me, and when I, in my vulnerability, found the strength to let go, if only for a fleeting moment. And though the anomalies may have subsided for now, I remain ever watchful, knowing that time is a living thing, and its whispers may one day beckon me back to that enchanted corner of the world. This is my story. A journey through the echoes of time, a confrontation with the specters of history, and a search for solace amid the fragmented tapestry of memory. I leave Clear Lake behind with a quiet certainty that even as we strive to control our destiny, the past will always have its say, and sometimes the whispers of time can change us in ways we never imagined. My name is Richard Rick Manning, and I am 38 years old. This happened one chilly autumn when I left behind the suffocating chaos of the city and set out in my old RV for some much-needed isolation in the backwoods near Maquoketa, Iowa. I'd spent years in urban environments and even served in the military, experiences that left me with scars both seen and unseen. I thought that by finding solitude in the wilderness, I might finally escape the ghosts of my past and rebuild some semblance of peace. The RV was a relic even when I bought it, a clunky, aging model that creaked with every turn of the road. I had done my best to patch up the engine, but it was clear that the vehicle and I shared a similar fragility. The power supply was erratic, the radio would sputter static during quiet moments, and every mechanical failure only reinforced the isolation I was chasing. Yet, I pushed on, drawn by the promise of silence and the hope that the vast, empty spaces might offer a fresh start. After a long, winding drive through dense forests and over rugged, unpaved roads, I finally pulled into a secluded RV park. The place was miles from the nearest town, an isolated pocket of existence tucked away amidst abandoned farmlands and shadowed woodlands. At first glance it appeared serene. A few scattered RVs, a dirt lot, and a canopy of towering trees that filtered the afternoon sunlight into mottled patterns on the ground. But as I began to settle in, I noticed little details that set my nerves on edge. A lingering odor of diesel mixed with something sour, faint tire tracks that led nowhere, and the unsettling hum of an engine that wasn't mine. I unloaded my belongings and set up my modest camp near the edge of the park. I wasn't one for idle chatter, so I mostly kept to myself as I organized my gear and checked the RV's gauges. The radio, which I relied on for company during long nights, crackled to life with fragments of static and unintelligible murmurs. At first, I assumed it was just interference from the aging circuitry. But then, amid the static, I distinctly heard voices discussing something ominous. Words like shipment, transfer, and dead-end road punctuated the low hum of conversation. I dismissed it as local chatter or perhaps a prank, but the unease it stirred was impossible to ignore. That first night, as the wind picked up and the trees rattled against one another, I tried to catch some sleep. Instead, I lay awake, the sound of the wind mingling with the occasional distant thump on the RV's metal frame. A couple of hours later, I was abruptly awakened by the sound of soft knocking, not at the door, but coming from somewhere outside. I fumbled for my flashlight and peered out of the window, but the darkness revealed nothing more than the swaying silhouettes of trees. I told myself it was nothing but my overactive imagination fueled by the isolation. The following morning, I decided to stretch my legs and explore the surroundings. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, a well-worn notebook, and my cell phone, even though reception was spotty, and set out along a narrow path that wound through the woods. I kept my eyes open for any signs of wildlife or anything else unusual. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. A set of tire tracks crossing the trail, fresh and deep, as though a large vehicle had recently passed through at high speed. They weren't ordinary tracks from a farm truck, and they led off into the denser part of the forest, disappearing abruptly at what seemed to be an impenetrable thicket. Returning to the RV, I found a small envelope taped to the door. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. Inside was a handwritten note that simply read, "Turn back now. This is not for you." The handwriting was rough, hurried, almost desperate. I scanned the area for any sign of pranksters, but there was no one in sight. I tried to dismiss it as a local warning or a misguided joke, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that I had inadvertently crossed a line I wasn't meant to cross. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at the RV park grew increasingly tense. The isolation that had once promised solace now felt suffocating. I began noticing strange vehicle patterns at odd hours, a black SUV idling near the tree line at dawn, headlights that appeared and vanished like specters, and even a couple of abandoned cars left with their engines running briefly before sputtering to a stop. Late at night, I would catch the sound of muffled voices drifting through the darkness, only to vanish when I tried to pinpoint their origin. One particularly crisp evening, after a long day of recording ambient sounds and scribbling notes, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the park. The air was cool and the sky, a deep indigo, was littered with stars. As I strolled, I noticed a series of unusual marks on the ground, a pattern of footprints that seemed too deliberate to be random animal tracks. They led toward a narrow, overgrown path that I hadn't noticed before. My military training urged me to be cautious, so I crept forward, flashlight in hand. The trail led me to an abandoned truck parked in a clearing. Its paint was peeling and the tires were half buried in mud. But what caught my attention was the pile of items scattered around it. There were several personal belongings: a woman's purse, a man's wallet, even a child's toy, along with bundles of contraband hidden under a tattered tarp. Documents fluttered in the cold wind, and I picked one up to read. The paper was stained and worn, but the words were unmistakable. They mentioned names, dates, and locations. It was clear that this truck was not simply abandoned. It was a part of something far more sinister. A chill raced down my spine as I realized what I'd stumbled upon. The evidence pointed to a human trafficking operation, a ruthless network that preyed on the vulnerable. My instincts, honed through years of military service and surviving urban warfare, kicked in immediately. I snapped photos of everything with my camera, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary, and tucked the documents away in my jacket. My mind raced with questions. Who was behind this operation? How did it come to be operating so close to my secluded haven? And most importantly, what did they want with me? I hurried back to the RV, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I drove, I kept a wary eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a tail. Sure enough, a few minutes later, I noticed a dark sedan cruising at a distance, its headlights off, and its movement too deliberate to be coincidental. I shifted into a lower gear and took a side road, the RV's old engine protesting with every mile. The sedan followed, its silent pursuit raising my adrenaline to a fever pitch. I pulled over in a clearing near the edge of the woods to assess the situation. The night was thick, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. I stepped out of the RV, my military training forcing me into a defensive stance. I scanned the darkened trees and found nothing but shadows. Yet, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I radioed in a brief message over the malfunctioning channel of my RV's radio, a desperate, garbled plea for help. I wasn't sure if anyone would hear, but I had to try. Minutes later, the sedan sped past the clearing, its taillights a fading red smear in the darkness. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with mere curiosity. Someone was actively hunting me. With no time to waste, I gathered my evidence and headed back to the RV, my mind racing with plans of escape and retaliation. I made sure to lock all the doors and window latches, every instinct screaming that the enemy could be lurking just beyond the thin walls of metal that separated me from danger. The following night was a blur of tension and adrenaline. I could hear faint voices outside, snatches of conversation that sounded angry and desperate. I peered out the window, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and saw shadowy figures moving stealthily among the trees. My hands trembled, not just from fear, but from the weight of my own memories. The horrors of combat, the betrayal that had driven me to seek refuge in isolation. I was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This was calculated, cold, and deeply personal. The next morning, I decided that I couldn't simply wait for my pursuers to catch up with me. I needed to take action and expose the operation, even if it meant putting myself in harm's way. I gathered all the evidence I had collected, the photos, the documents, the discarded belongings, and prepared to send a detailed report to a trusted contact in law enforcement. As I was about to upload the files on my battered laptop, the RV's radio crackled to life once more. This time, it wasn't the static of malfunctioning electronics, but a clear, menacing voice. "Leave now, Rick. You're in over your head," it hissed. The voice was cold, devoid of any pretense of warning. It was a direct message from those who wanted the operation to remain hidden. I felt a surge of anger and resolve. I wasn't going to run away, not when innocent lives were at stake. With the evidence secured, I decided to drive to a nearby town to alert the authorities. But as I started the engine, the RV shuddered and sputtered, as if it were protesting the sudden urgency. I managed to limp it along a side road, but the sedan I'd seen earlier reappeared, this time in closer pursuit. The chase began in earnest on the narrow, winding roads of the backwoods. Every twist and turn was a battle between my instincts and the relentless pursuit of those who would silence me. I maneuvered the RV through dense clusters of trees and along poorly maintained backroads, my heart pounding with every acceleration and brake. At one point, the sedan cut me off, forcing me to swerve into a ditch. The RV groaned under the strain, and I fought to regain control. My military training took over. I had to be precise, tactical. I managed to escape the immediate danger, but I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Under the cover of darkness, I abandoned the RV and began trekking through the underbrush, clutching my evidence and a small sidearm I kept for emergencies. I moved silently, every step measured, every sense on high alert. The forest was a maze of shadows and sounds, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being surrounded by unseen eyes. Hours later, I reached a dilapidated farmhouse on the edge of the woods, a place that looked like it had been abandoned for years, but still bore the scars of recent activity. I crept up to the building, heart hammering in my chest. This, I sensed, was the nerve center of the operation. I peered through a grimy window and saw evidence of recent habitation. Scattered papers, a half-burned candle, and, most disturbingly, a map pinned to the wall with various names and locations marked in red ink. I knew that I couldn't confront the criminals head-on without a plan. I retreated to a safe distance and observed the farmhouse for a while, noting the movements of the figures who came and went. It became clear that the operation was run by a ruthless gang, and their leader, whose presence exuded authority and menace, was on site. I had to act quickly, both to save myself and to ensure that these criminals would be exposed. With a surge of determination fueled by memories of past battles and a burning sense of justice, I formulated a plan. I would wait until nightfall, when the shadows provided me cover, and then infiltrate the farmhouse to gather further evidence and, if possible, confront the gang leader. My mind churned with conflicting emotions, the desire for retribution mixed with the need to save any potential victims caught in the crossfire. I was no longer just a solitary veteran seeking peace. I was a man with a mission to end the cruelty that had festered in these backwoods. That night, under a slate-gray sky and a crescent moon, I made my move. I approached the farmhouse quietly, using every bit of stealth I had learned during my years in the military. The building was dark, the only sound the low murmur of voices inside. I managed to slip in through a broken window and crept through the musty corridors, my flashlight revealing only peeling wallpaper and long-forgotten memories of happier times. I found the room where the gang leader was stationed. A makeshift office littered with maps, documents, and a computer that blinked with evidence of the trafficking operation. Before I could gather all the incriminating details, the door burst open, and I was met with the force of several armed men. A struggle ensued. A chaotic, desperate melee in the cramped space. Bullets ricocheted off old wood and metal, and my heart pounded as I fought to maintain control. I ducked behind a desk, the sound of shouts and the smell of gunpowder mixing with the fear that had become my constant companion. In the melee, I managed to disarm one of the attackers and used the opportunity to secure the documents and take a few clear photos of the operation's inner workings. But the real challenge came when the gang leader stepped forward. A man with cold eyes and a sneer that spoke of cruelty. His voice was calm and menacing as he addressed me. "You should have stayed away, Rick." His words cut through the chaos like a knife, dredging up memories of past betrayals and the relentless pressure of war. My military instincts surged, and I fought back with everything I had, a mixture of anger and determination driving my every move. The confrontation escalated rapidly. In a final burst of action, I managed to subdue the gang leader, pinning him to the ground as I delivered a flurry of accusations and demands for answers. In that desperate moment, I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that I had once known, only twisted into something far more sinister. I grabbed his phone and recorded his trembling confession, every word a damning testament to the horrors of the trafficking operation. The commotion alerted the rest of the gang, and I knew I had to send out my distress signal before reinforcements arrived. With shaking hands, I used the radio transmitter I'd hidden in a corner of the farmhouse to send out a clear, urgent message. "This is Rick Manning. I have evidence of a human trafficking operation. I need immediate assistance. I repeat, I need immediate assistance." My voice was steady, though inside I was anything but calm. The ensuing minutes were a blur of violence and adrenaline as I fought off the remaining attackers. My sidearm discharged repeatedly, and my military training kept me one step ahead even as my body began to ache with fatigue. In the chaos, I managed to escape through a back door, sprinting into the dark forest with the sound of pursuit echoing behind me. I ran until I could no longer hear the shouts and footsteps, the forest swallowing me in its cold embrace. Eventually, my exhaustion forced me to slow down, and I found a small clearing where I could catch my breath. There, under the cover of dense foliage and the watchful eyes of ancient trees, I allowed myself a moment of relief. I clutched the evidence tightly, a small bundle of photos, documents, and the recorded confession, and vowed that this would not be the end. Dawn broke with a reluctant light, and as I made my way back to the RV, carefully avoiding known patrol routes, I could sense that the tide of danger had receded, at least temporarily. I rejoined my battered RV and drove slowly toward the nearest town, my heart heavy with the cost of the night's events. The authorities eventually arrived, drawn by the urgency of my distress signal and the undeniable evidence I had amassed. Interviews were conducted, and the dark underbelly of the trafficking operation began to unravel piece by piece. I was left with deep physical scars and an even deeper psychological burden. The memory of that night, the chase, the confrontation in the dilapidated farmhouse, and the desperate fight for survival would haunt me for years to come. Yet, amidst the pain and loss, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I had not only survived, but had also uncovered a sinister network that preyed on the vulnerable. A network that I vowed to expose at any cost. Now, as I write these words, far from those haunted backwoods, I carry with me the heavy knowledge of what I witnessed on that dead-end road. I am scarred, both in body and spirit, but I also know that my actions that night helped to bring a measure of justice to a part of the world steeped in cruelty and corruption. I still check my old radio every now and then, half expecting to catch a stray fragment of that ominous conversation, or see headlights in the distance as a reminder that danger lurks in the most isolated places. I have come to understand that isolation in the wilderness is a double-edged sword. It can offer peace and solitude, but it also exposes you to the darkest corners of human nature, where the cries of the forgotten echo in abandoned farmlands and the rustle of leaves conceals secrets too terrible to imagine. My journey on that dead-end road forced me to confront not only a ruthless criminal enterprise, but also the inner demons I had carried since my days in the military. In facing them, I found a renewed resolve to fight for justice and to ensure that the vulnerable would not be forgotten. This is my story, a journey of survival, a battle against human cruelty, and a personal reckoning with the darkness that sometimes hides in the isolated corners of our world. Every mile I travel, every shadow I pass, reminds me of that fateful autumn night. And though the scars remain, I continue forward, determined to expose the truth and offer hope to those who have been lost in the abyss. My name is Rick Manning, and the dead-end road I once feared now serves as a grim reminder of what it takes to survive in a world where isolation can reveal both the best and worst in humanity. My name is Dylan Harper, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in late October 2023, during what was meant to be an adventurous long weekend in Iowa. I had been planning this RV trip with my two closest friends, Riley Jacobs, the ever-skeptical realist, and Casey Monroe, whose sensitivity to the unseen had always both fascinated and unnerved me. Our destination was Effigy Mounds National Monument, a place where ancient indigenous earthworks stand as silent sentinels over the Iowa landscape. I was eager to explore these mounds and immerse myself in the legends that swirled around them, not knowing that our journey would soon descend into a nightmare of supernatural dread. We set off on a crisp autumn morning in my aging RV, a trusted but far from perfect vehicle that had seen better days. As we rolled down the highway, the trees along the roadside blazed with fiery hues of orange and red. I could feel the excitement bubbling in my veins. The promise of isolation, natural beauty, and a break from our monotonous routines was irresistible. Not long after we departed, our troubles began. The RV's generator sputtered and coughed, its lights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. Riley, ever the technician, knelt by the dashboard, frowning at the erratic readings on the GPS. "This thing's acting up again," he grumbled, tapping a blinking error code. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the vagaries of an old vehicle, but the unease was palpable. Casey sat quietly in the back, eyes wide and distant, as though she sensed that the day's troubles were only a prelude to something far more sinister. We arrived at Effigy Mounds by mid-afternoon, parking the RV in a designated spot near the park's entrance. The monument itself was a sprawling landscape of ancient mounds rising like silent echoes of a long-forgotten past. I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of awe and trepidation as we unloaded our gear. Casey's hands trembled slightly as she unhooked her camera, and even Riley's practical demeanor wavered when he looked up at the vast, unyielding earthworks. That first night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling silence enveloped the campsite. The usual hum of insects and distant calls of wildlife were absent, replaced instead by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I sat by the feeble glow of our campfire, listening to the wind rustling through the dry autumn leaves. Rustling that sometimes sounded too deliberate, too aware. I tried to shake off the growing disquiet, chalking it up to the isolation of the place and my own overactive imagination. The next morning, determined to make the most of our trip despite the RV's lingering issues, we set out to explore the mounds on foot. The crisp air was refreshing, yet as we walked, an uncanny chill seemed to seep from the very ground beneath our feet. I led the way, my heart pounding with both excitement and a strange sense of foreboding. Casey trailed close behind me, her eyes flitting nervously from one shadow to the next, while Riley, ever the pragmatist, kept a steady pace, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It wasn't long before we encountered our first inexplicable sign of something amiss. Deep in the woods, near one of the largest mounds, we stumbled upon a clearing where stones had been arranged in a deliberate geometric pattern. Nearby, on the bark of an ancient oak, were carved symbols, strange, flowing marks that looked eerily similar to indigenous ritual art, but with an unsettling distortion. I knelt to examine them, a chill running down my spine as I realized they weren't natural at all. Casey's whisper broke the silence. "They're like warnings, or prayers." Riley scoffed, shaking his head. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, but his tone was less assured than usual. As we continued our hike, we discovered more signs. Faint, unusual footprints pressed into the soft earth near our campsite. They were larger than any humans and oddly shaped, as if belonging to something not quite of this world. Each step we took deepened the sense of isolation, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes. That evening, as we sat around our malfunctioning RV with the failing generator barely keeping the lights on, the air grew inexplicably cold. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the campsite, extinguishing our small fire and sending shivers down our spines. It was then that we heard it, a faint, mournful whisper, almost like a plea carried on the wind. I looked at Casey, whose face had gone pale, and Riley, who now wore a look of grim concern. The voice was indistinct, but it filled the silence with a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside to get some fresh air and to see if I could catch any sign of what was happening. In the pale light of the moon, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the distance, a gaunt, spectral silhouette that seemed to hover near one of the mounds. Its eyes, when they finally met mine, burned with a sorrowful fury that sent my heart pounding in terror. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something truly supernatural, but I knew instinctively that we were no longer alone. The following day, the tension among us was nearly palpable. I was determined to follow the trail of mysterious symbols and eerie signs, convinced that they were connected to the legends of a vengeful guardian spirit. Riley, his skepticism now mingled with unease, argued for retreat. "We're getting in over our heads, Dylan," he said, his voice low and urgent as we surveyed the area near one of the larger mounds. "This isn't just old legends or faulty equipment anymore. Something's off, and it's not safe." Casey, her eyes shining with tears that spoke of deep intuition, added quietly, "We shouldn't be here, not without showing proper respect. These lands are sacred, and when you disturb them, the consequences can be dire." Her words, soft yet laden with an undeniable gravity, sent a chill through me. I was torn between my insatiable curiosity and the rising tide of dread that now shadowed every step. Late that afternoon, we reached a particularly eerie section of the monument. The earth around us seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the air grew heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. We decided to set up a temporary camp to rest and gather our thoughts. That night, the atmosphere reached a fever pitch of dread. As darkness deepened, the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant echo of a forlorn cry. It was then that the supernatural revealed itself in full force. As I lay in my bunk trying to shake off the terror of the night, I awoke to the sound of whispering voices. I sat up, heart hammering, and saw the spectral figure again. A gaunt indigenous guardian, its eyes alight with a sorrowful, burning intensity. The figure moved with a spectral grace that belied its otherworldly nature, drifting silently between the trees. It lingered at the edge of our camp, its presence overwhelming yet inexplicably sorrowful. Unable to contain our fear any longer, we convened in the RV the next morning. Riley's rational mind, however, was already racing for solutions. "We need to figure out what's happening here," he said, scanning through his notes and hastily gathered research on local legends. I could see the conflict in his eyes, a battle between his insistence on rational explanations and the undeniable evidence that our world was now intersecting with something beyond it. Casey, trembling, suggested we try to make amends with the spirit. Maybe we need to show respect. I found something in one of the old books. Indigenous prayers and rituals meant to appease restless spirits. I hesitated, my mind torn between logic and the primal fear that had now taken root. Yet, as I looked into the haunted eyes of my friends, I knew we had no choice but to attempt something, anything, that might restore balance. With our RV now practically immobilized by persistent technical malfunctions, the generator's constant groaning, the flickering lights, and a GPS that refused to point us in any logical direction, we were stranded in this ancient and enigmatic place. In desperation, we agreed to perform a makeshift ritual, piecing together indigenous prayers and symbolic gestures from our research. We gathered what little we had. A circle of stones arranged in a pattern we hoped mirrored the ancient symbols we'd seen carved on trees, and a few offerings we'd managed to scrounge from our supplies. Under a sky heavy with ominous clouds, we began the ritual. I led the invocation, my voice shaking as I recited the words that Casey had shown me. A prayer meant to honor the land and the spirit that guarded it. The wind picked up around us, swirling leaves and debris in a chaotic dance. Casey's eyes glistened with tears as she joined in, her soft voice melding with mine in a desperate plea for forgiveness and protection. Riley, ever the skeptic, hesitated, but in that moment, I could see he was too afraid to refuse. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew colder still, and a palpable tension seemed to radiate from the earth itself. As we neared the completion of our prayer, the spectral figure reappeared, its form more distinct than ever before. The spirit's eyes blazed with an unholy light, and the air vibrated with a low, almost guttural sound, as though the land itself was groaning under the weight of its wrath. Without warning, the ground beneath us shuddered violently. I barely had time to register the shock before a deafening crash shattered the stillness of the night. A section of the ancient mound, destabilized by the furious energy unleashed by our ritual, collapsed in a torrent of earth and stone. Amid the chaos, I caught a horrified glimpse of Riley, pinned beneath falling debris. His eyes met mine for a fleeting, desperate moment before everything went dark. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding with frantic sorrow and terror. Casey screamed, and I could hear her desperate calls as she tried to lift rubble away from our friend. But the damage was done. The violent force of the collapse had shattered the fragile barrier between our world and something far more ancient and vengeful. In the ensuing chaos, Riley's cries faded into a haunting silence that still echoes in my mind. In the painful aftermath, as the spectral guardian's form retreated into the darkness, Casey and I were left alone with our grief and mounting terror. The RV, our only means of escape, continued to malfunction, its systems battered by the very forces we had unwittingly provoked. We gathered what little we could salvage, our supplies, our courage, and the fragments of our shattered hopes, and made our way back to the RV under the oppressive weight of the night. The journey back was a blur of desperate attempts to fix the failing vehicle and the constant, nagging dread that the spirit was still watching us. The forest around us was alive with sounds. The snapping of twigs, rustling in the underbrush, and that persistent, sorrowful whisper that seemed to follow us at every turn. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the spectral guardian emerging from the shadows once more. Casey, tears streaking down her face, mumbled prayers under her breath, pleading for forgiveness and safe passage. I tried to offer words of reassurance, though inside I was consumed by guilt and horror at what we had unleashed. The realization hit me hard. Our curiosity and disregard for the sacred customs of this ancient land had exacted a terrible price. As dawn broke, the oppressive night gave way to a cold, gray morning. With trembling hands, I managed to coax the RV's engine to life, each sputter a reminder of our isolation and the fragile barrier between life and death we now inhabited. We drove away slowly, the mounds receding into the distance, but the shadow of that vengeful spirit clung to us like a curse. In the days that followed, Casey and I tried to piece together a semblance of normalcy. Yet, every creak of the RV, every whisper of the wind, and every flicker of light on the dashboard was a grim reminder of that fateful night. I found myself haunted by memories of Riley's final, terrified gaze and the sorrowful eyes of the spectral guardian. I began to understand that some places are sacred for a reason, and that meddling with forces beyond our comprehension can lead to irreversible consequences. I spent countless sleepless nights poring over old texts and indigenous lore, desperate to understand what had truly transpired at Effigy Mounds National Monument. The accounts I uncovered spoke of a guardian spirit, an ancient force that had watched over these lands for centuries, punishing those who dared to disturb its resting place. The stories were shrouded in myth and mystery, passed down through generations in whispers and warnings. They described an entity capable of both sorrowful lamentation and ferocious retribution. A spirit that was not content to merely haunt, but to actively defend its sacred domain with violent determination. In my heart, I knew that the spirit we had encountered was not a mere phantom, but the living embodiment of that ancient guardian. It had sensed our intrusion, our arrogance, and had responded in a way that was as swift as it was merciless. The fact that Riley had been fatally caught in the collapse was a harsh, irrevocable lesson. Some powers in this world are not meant to be trifled with, and the price of ignorance can be steep. Now, as I write these words from the safety of a distant, quieter RV park far from the haunted mounds, I am tormented by the knowledge that the spirit still lingers. I have heard reports from locals of eerie sightings and unexplained phenomena near Effigy Mounds, and I cannot help but wonder if the Guardian's wrath has only grown stronger with time. Casey, too, has been deeply affected by the ordeal. The once gentle and empathetic soul now carries a quiet sorrow in her eyes, a constant reminder of the night when the sacred was violated and a friend was lost. Every time I close my eyes, I see the spectral figure drifting among the trees, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly fire, and I hear Riley's desperate cry echoing in the silence. The guilt of our actions, our impulsive disregard for a power we barely understood, haunts me relentlessly. I have come to accept that some mysteries of the world are not meant to be unraveled by mortal hands. In our pursuit of adventure and excitement, we unwittingly trespassed on hallowed ground, and the land demanded its due. I've learned that survival in such circumstances requires more than physical resilience or resourcefulness. It demands respect for the ancient, unknowable forces that shape our world. The experience has changed me irrevocably. I now approach life with a profound humility and a deep-seated fear of the unseen, knowing that beneath the surface of our everyday existence lie forces that can awaken in a moment's notice and alter our fates forever. So, I offer this account as both a cautionary tale and a personal confession, a testament to the thin line that separates our world from the realm of the supernatural. In the silence of the mounds, I heard the cries of the past and the fury of a guardian wronged. And though I continue to live, the memory of that vengeful spirit remains, a dark shadow that reminds me every day. Some things are best left undisturbed. Even now, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows lengthen, I can almost feel the weight of the ancient guardian's gaze. I sometimes wonder if somewhere among the silent mounds, the spirit waits patiently for the next unwary soul, ready to exact its terrible, timeless justice once more.